Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. The first time I saw the house, I thought someone had cleared the brush around it recently. It stood at the end of Morrow Lane, a narrow gravel road about 12 miles outside Paducah, Kentucky. I had been carrying that route for almost 3 years, and as far as I knew, the road ended at a rusted cattle gate with an overgrown field behind it. There were 4 active addresses along the lane, all old farmhouses set far apart. The last mailbox belonged to Earl and Denise Larkin at number 418. That Monday morning, there was a new mailbox about half a mile past the Larkins' place. It was plain black metal on a fresh wooden post. The numbers 466 had been painted on the side in white. The gravel road continued past it, even though I was sure it had stopped at the gate before. I slowed the mail truck and looked ahead. The gate was gone. The road ran between 2 rows of bare trees and ended at a small 2-story house. It had gray siding, a steep roof, and a covered porch. No cars were parked outside. No curtains moved in the windows. I checked the mail tray. There were 3 envelopes for 466 Morrow Lane. One was from an insurance company. One looked like a bank statement. The third was a handwritten letter addressed to a woman named Ruth Bell. I assumed the address had been added while I was off the previous Friday. Route changes sometimes appeared without anyone warning the carrier. People bought land, put up prefab houses, or moved into old family property. It happened. I stopped at the mailbox and delivered the letters. The box was empty. When I pulled away, I looked in the side mirror. The front door of the house was open. I had not seen it open before. A woman stood behind the screen door. She looked older, maybe in her late 60s. She wore a dark blue sweater and held one hand against the frame. She did not wave. She just watched the truck. I lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel, the way I did for everyone on the route. She stepped back, and the door closed. Nothing about it seemed serious at the time. The only thing that bothered me was the road. I could not remember driving that extra half-mile before. That afternoon, I checked the edit book at the post office. There was no official route change for Morrow Lane. Number 466 was not listed. I showed the envelopes to my supervisor, Janice Crowley. She glanced at the address and said the sorting system sometimes accepted new construction before the route records were updated. "Just keep delivering it," she said. "We'll see if it sticks." Tuesday was warm and cloudy. There were 2 letters for Ruth Bell and a small padded envelope addressed to Calvin Bell. The new mailbox was still there. I noticed tire marks in the gravel leading toward the house, but they were narrow and deep, almost like wagon wheels. There were no normal tread patterns. When I opened the mailbox, the 3 letters from Monday were gone. I put the new mail inside and looked toward the porch. A man stood at one of the upstairs windows. He wore a white shirt. I could see his head and shoulders, but the glass was dark enough that I could not make out his face. I waited for him to move. He did not. A vehicle came up behind me, so I pulled forward to let it pass. It was an old red pickup driven by Marvin Pike, who lived on County Road 9. Marvin raised his hand as he went by. The pickup continued past the mailbox toward the house. That surprised me because I thought the property was private. I watched until the truck reached the trees. It did not come out the other side. There was nowhere for it to turn before the house, and I never saw it parked in the yard. I finished the route and told myself Marvin must have taken a field access road hidden by the trees. On Wednesday, heavy rain started before dawn. The gravel roads were soft and water ran through the ditches. I considered skipping the last part of Morrow Lane because the mail truck handled badly in mud, but there were 5 pieces for number 466. 3 were addressed to Ruth Bell. 1 was for Calvin. 1 had no name, only current resident. The black mailbox looked dry. Water ran off every other box on the road, but there were no drops on its door or sides. The wooden post was pale and clean, without mud splashed around the base. I opened it. Tuesday's mail was still inside. I almost left the new letters with it, but the box was crowded. I stacked everything neatly and closed the door. A knocking sound came from the direction of the house. It was slow and regular. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 3 more. I looked toward the porch. The screen door was moving back and forth, though there was almost no wind. It opened about 6 inches and closed again. Each time it shut, I heard the knocking sound. The upstairs window was empty. I got back into the truck and drove to the Larkins' house. Denise was outside dragging a trash bin away from the road. I stopped and asked whether she knew the people who had moved into number 466. She looked past me toward the end of the lane. "What number?" she asked. "The gray house past your place." She stared at me for a second. "There's no house past us." I thought she had misheard me because of the rain. I explained about the new mailbox and said I had been delivering to Ruth and Calvin Bell. Denise's face changed. She stepped closer to the truck. "You've been going past our gate?" I told her there was no gate. "Yes, there is," she said. "It's been there since before we bought this place." I looked back down the road. From where we stood, the curve and trees blocked the end of the lane. Denise asked me to wait while she called Earl. He came out wearing work boots and a brown rain jacket. I repeated the story. When I said the name Bell, he looked at Denise but did not say anything right away. Then he asked, "Ruth Bell?" I said yes. Earl rested one hand on the side of the mail truck. "The Bells lived back there a long time ago," he said. "House has been empty since the 70s. I asked what he meant by back there. He said the property beyond their gate belonged to the Bell family. The original house had burned sometime before he moved to the area. People still called the field the Bell Place, but there was nothing standing except part of a chimney and an old well. Denise said, "Ruth died before I was born." The rain hit the truck roof hard enough that the 3 of us had to raise our voices. I asked whether there had ever been a Calvin Bell. Earl nodded once. "Her son." I tried to laugh, but it came out wrong. I told them I had seen the house that morning. I had delivered mail there for 3 days. I had seen a woman at the door and a man in the upstairs window. Earl walked around to the passenger side of the truck and looked through the windshield toward the road. "You didn't go through any gate?" he asked. "No." "And the lane kept going?" "Yes." He told me not to drive back there. I said I needed to check the address and pick up the old mail if the house was not occupied. He said, "Leave it." Denise asked whether I could show them the mail. I told her it was already in the box. That bothered her more than anything else. She asked why mail would be arriving for people who had been dead for decades. I did not have an answer. I finished the route without going back. At the post office, I searched the address database again. Number 466 still did not appear. I checked the physical letters waiting for Thursday's route. There were 7 pieces for the Bell address. Janice looked through them with me. None seemed like junk mail. There was a utility bill, a catalog, 2 personal letters, a medical statement, and a county tax notice. The tax notice had a return address for the McCracken County clerk. Janice called the clerk's office. They had no record of mailing anything to 466 Morrow Lane. She held the envelope up to the light and said it looked legitimate. We opened it under the dead letter procedure because the address was questionable. Inside was a property tax statement for Ruth Bell. The paper looked new. The amount due was $38.12. The tax year, printed at the top, was 1956. Janice stopped treating it like a sorting mistake after that. She put the mail in a plastic tray and said she would contact postal inspection. Thursday morning, the tray was gone. Janice accused me of moving it. I had not. We checked the locked office where she had stored it. The cabinet was still locked, and nothing else was missing. At 8:30, the sorting machine sent out 4 more letters for number 466. Janice pulled them from my route and told me not to deliver them. I left for the route with an empty slot where the Bell mail should have been. The weather had cleared, the sky was bright, and the fields were wet from the rain. By the time I reached Morrow Lane, I had almost convinced myself that I had misunderstood the Larkins. The black mailbox was gone. The gravel road ended at a rusted cattle gate. I stopped the truck. The gate crossed the road exactly where I remembered it from previous years. Weeds grew around the posts. The chain was red with rust and wrapped through the bars several times. Beyond it was an overgrown field. There was no gravel extension, no line of bare trees, and no gray house. I got out and walked to the gate. The ground on the other side was thick with weeds and standing water. No tire tracks crossed it. About 200 yards away, part of a brick chimney rose above the brush. I took pictures with my phone. When I zoomed in on the chimney, I noticed a dark shape to the right of it. It looked like someone standing in the field. I lowered the phone and looked with my own eyes. Nothing was there. I drove to the Larkins' house and told Earl the mailbox was gone. He came outside with me and walked to the gate. He did not seem surprised. I showed him the pictures. He looked at the dark shape near the chimney and handed the phone back. "That's where the porch used to be," he said. I asked him what had happened to the bells. He said Ruth had lived there with her husband and their 2 sons. The husband left, and 1 son moved to Ohio. Calvin, the younger son, stayed with Ruth. In the winter of 1958, neighbors saw lights moving around the property for several nights. Not car lights. Earl described them as pale lights passing between the trees. A week later, Ruth and Calvin stopped being seen in town. The sheriff went to the house. It was empty, and the doors were unlocked. Food was still on the table. Nobody knew where they had gone. The house remained standing until a fire destroyed most of it in 1974. I asked whether the bodies had ever been found. Earl said no. That made the mail feel different to me. Until then, I had assumed Ruth and Calvin were confirmed dead. Finding out they had simply vanished made me feel sick. I asked Earl whether anyone had reported seeing the house since the fire. He looked toward the chimney. "People see things in that field," he said. "Usually from the road. Nobody I know has driven up to it." I returned to work and showed Janice the photos. She had already spoken with a postal inspector named Warren Hales. He planned to come by the next morning. At 2:15 that afternoon, 2 men entered the post office. I was in the break room eating a sandwich when Janice called me to the front. The men stood near the counter. Both wore black suits under dark raincoats, even though the day was warm and sunny. One was tall with a narrow face and thinning blonde hair. The other was shorter and heavier, with a deep crease across his forehead. They did not look like postal inspectors. They carried no bags, folders, or identification badges. The taller man introduced himself as Mr. Shaw. He introduced the other as Mr. Danner. He did not give first names. Mr. Shaw said they were conducting an address verification review. Janice asked which agency they worked for. He said, "Federal Field Services." I had never heard of it. Janice asked to see identification. Both men produced black wallets at the same time. They opened them for less than a second. I saw photographs and some kind of seal, but the text was too small to read. Mr. Danner looked at me. "You carry Rural Route 4, he said. It was not a question. I said yes. He asked for the names of every person who received mail on that route. I told him that information was private. "We require a complete list," he said. "Current residents, former residents, temporary names, and forwarding names." Janice told them they would need a written request. Mr. Shaw turned toward her. "A written request was received yesterday," he said. "No, it wasn't. It was received at 1612. The post office closed at 4. Janice said nobody had been there at 1612. Mr. Shaw looked at the wall clock. The second hand had stopped. I noticed the fluorescent lights were making a faint humming sound. The sound grew louder while we stood there, then dropped away. Mr. Danner asked me whether I had delivered mail to 466 Morrow Lane. I said I had delivered to a mailbox marked with that number. "How many days?" 3. "Did anyone take the mail?" I hesitated. The first day's letters had been gone on Tuesday, but the second day's mail was still there Wednesday. I told him some of it had been removed. Mr. Shaw and Mr. Danner looked at each other. It was the first sign of emotion either man had shown. Mr. Shaw asked, "Which day was the box empty?" I said Tuesday. He stepped closer to the counter. "Who did you see at the residence?" I asked why that mattered. He repeated the question. I told him I had seen an older woman at the front door and a man upstairs. Mr. Danner asked whether the woman had raised her left hand. I stared at him. I had never told anyone which hand she had held against the doorframe. I was not even sure it had been her left until he said it. "How do you know that?" I asked. He ignored me. Mr. Shaw said, "Did she speak?" "No." "Did the man?" "No." "Did either of them follow you away from the property?" I said no. Mr. No. Danner asked for the route list again. Janice told them to leave. Mr. Shaw placed one hand on the counter. His fingernails were clean and evenly cut, but the skin around them looked gray. "There are 31 active names on Rural Route 4, he said. "We need to know which 6 are not active." Janice went still. There were 37 names in the route book, including temporary forwards and vacant addresses. I had counted them myself the previous month. There was no way he should have known that. I asked what he meant by not active. He looked directly at me. "You delivered to 2 of them this week." The room felt smaller after he said that. I asked whether he meant Ruth and Calvin Bell. Mr. Danner said, "Those are not the names we are asking about." Janice reached for the phone to call the sheriff. The lights shut off. The front lobby had large windows, so the room did not go dark, but every machine stopped at once. The sorting equipment, the ceiling fans, even the soda machine in the hallway. The wall clock started moving again. Mr. Shaw removed his hand from the counter. "We will return when the route is corrected," he said. The men walked outside. Their car was parked across the road. It was a black sedan with no visible license plate. The paint looked dull, as if it had been sitting outside for years. They got in and drove east. The power came back before their car reached the bend. Janice called the sheriff. A deputy searched the road but did not find the sedan. Warren Hales, the postal inspector, arrived early the next morning. He was a normal-looking man in his 50s with a government badge, a laptop bag, and a stack of forms. He said there was no agency called Federal Field Services connected with the Postal Service. He reviewed the security footage. The camera showed the 2 men entering the lobby and speaking with us. There was no audio. When the lights went off, the picture turned to static. The outside camera did not show their car. Hales asked me to drive the route with him. We went to Morrow Lane around 11. The cattle gate was still there. Number 460 was gone. At the Larkins' house, Denise told us a black car had been parked near the gate before sunrise. 2 men had stood in the road looking toward the old Bell property. She said they remained there for almost an hour. When Earl went outside, the men got into the car and left. Hales asked whether they spoke to him. Earl said no. Then he looked at me and said there had been a mailbox beside the gate that morning. Not the new black one. An older box, dented and leaning to one side. He had gone inside to get a pair of gloves before taking it down. When he came back, it was gone. I asked whether it had a number. He nodded. "Your house number," he said. My address was 72 Willowbrook Drive, on the other side of town. I finished the route with Hales in the passenger seat. Nothing else happened. That evening, I drove straight home. I checked my mirrors several times, but no car followed me. My house looked normal. My wife's SUV was in the driveway, and the kitchen lights were on. There was one envelope in our mailbox. It had no stamp and no postmark. My name was typed on the front. Inside was a photocopy of the Rural Route 4 address list. 6 names had been circled in black ink. Ruth Bell and Calvin Bell were 2 of them. The other 4 belonged to people I had spoken with that week. Earl Larkin, Denise Larkin, Janice Crowley, and me. At the bottom of the page, someone had typed a single line, "Delivery confirmed." I locked the doors and called Hales. He came to the house and took the envelope in an evidence bag. My wife and I stayed home that night. The next morning, I went to work by the main highway instead of the county roads. Hales was already waiting at the post office. The route book had been updated overnight. Number 466 Morrow Lane now appeared between the Larkins address and the end of the route. The resident names were blank. In the delivery notes, one instruction had been added: hold all mail for personal collection. I was filling in for the morning producer at WCRN when the call came through just after 6. The station was in a 1-story brick building outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, between a tire shop and a storage place. We mostly ran farm reports, local news, old country music, and a call-in show called County Line. That morning had been cold and foggy. The fog sat low over the highway and made the parking lot lights look blurry. I had arrived before 5, made coffee, checked the overnight wire stories, and started screening calls for Dale Mercer, the host. Most callers wanted to complain about property taxes or talk about the weather. The strange call came during the first commercial break. The man said his name was Aaron Voss. He sounded like he was in his 40s, maybe older. His voice was steady, but he kept stopping between sentences as if he was deciding what he should leave out. He asked if we covered unusual things people saw on the road. I told him it depended on what he meant. He said, "Something followed my car last night." I assumed he meant another vehicle. We got calls like that sometimes, especially from people driving home late from bars. I asked whether he had contacted the police. "There wasn't another car," he said. I looked through the studio window at Dale. He was reading an ad for a seed company and had about 30 seconds left. I asked Aaron where it happened. He said he had been driving north on Highway 63 after visiting his sister in Waterloo. It had been around 10:30. The road had been mostly empty and there had been light snow blowing across the fields. "At first I thought it was a plane," he said. "It was behind me and off to the left, a white light, not bright enough to light up the ground, just there." I asked how far away it had been. That was the problem. I couldn't tell. Dale finished the commercial and I put Aaron on hold. During the next song, I gave Dale a quick summary. He raised his eyebrows and smiled. Dale liked strange calls because they broke up the usual routine. "Record him," he said. "We'll use it after the 7 o'clock news." I switched the call to the production line and started a recording. Aaron repeated the story from the beginning. He had first noticed the light near Hudson. It stayed behind his left shoulder for several miles. When he slowed down, it slowed down. When he returned to 65, it matched him. He said he had rolled down his window because he expected to hear an engine. Instead, he heard a low pulsing sound. He tried to imitate it for me. It sounded like someone breathing across the opening of a glass bottle, except the pitch kept dropping. "Could it have been wind over your car?" I asked. That's what I told myself. But it stopped whenever the light moved away. I asked whether the object had a shape. I didn't see one at first. The light was in front of it or under it. I'm not sure. He went quiet again. I could hear the faint sound of traffic behind him. He said he was calling from a break room at the packaging plant where he worked. I asked how long it followed him. Close to 20 miles. And then, it came closer. His voice changed when he said that. Not louder or more emotional. It simply became careful. He said the light moved from the rear side of his car to a position almost directly above the passenger lane. The road ahead had been straight and empty. He could see the light reflected on wet patches of pavement, but it did not cast a normal beam. That was the first detail that bothered me. Aaron said the reflection kept appearing in different places. Sometimes it was directly beside his car. Sometimes it appeared 50 yards ahead, even though the light itself seemed to remain above and behind him. He turned on his interior light to check whether something inside the car was reflecting against the window. When he did that, his radio went silent. Not static. Silent. The display stayed on and the clock continued to change, but no sound came through the speakers. He changed stations. Nothing. Then the windshield wipers stopped halfway across the glass. He pressed the switch several times. The wipers did not move. He said the light shifted closer. For the first time, he saw a dark shape around it. He described it as a long oval, though he admitted that the fog and blowing snow made it hard to judge. It did not look solid in the usual way. Parts of it seemed darker than the sky, while other parts blended into the clouds. He became aware of two smaller lights farther back. They were dim and amber-colored. They held the same distance from each other, one on either side of the white light. I asked whether they might have been wing lights. There were no blinking lights, he said, and it was moving sideways. He explained that the object crossed behind his car without turning. It went from the driver's side of the road to the passenger side while keeping the same end pointed forward. That was the point when he became frightened. He accelerated to nearly 80. The object remained beside him. He passed a farmhouse with a bright security light over the yard. He expected the object to become easier to see, but as soon as he reached the property, all three lights disappeared. His radio came back at the same moment. A woman's voice was speaking in the middle of a sentence. Aaron recognized the station as ours, although he had been listening to a Waterloo music station before the sound stopped. I asked what the woman had been saying. She said, "You should continue north." I thought he had misheard an advertisement. We did not have a woman on the air at 10:30. Our overnight program came from a network feed, and the host was male. Aaron knew that. He listened to WCRN at work. He said the sentence repeated once exactly the same way. Then the radio returned to music from the station he had originally selected. A few seconds later, the object reappeared. This time it was ahead of him. It moved above the road at about the height of a utility pole. The white light faced him, but it did not glare into his windshield. He could look directly at it. He slowed to 30. The object slowed with him. He considered turning around, but the nearest side road was covered in snow and he was afraid of getting stuck. So I kept going, he said. He drove beneath it, or at least he thought he did. As his car reached the point directly below the light, everything outside became gray. He could still see the road lines, but the fields and utility poles were gone. The low pulsing sound returned, this time through the closed windows. His hands started tingling. The dashboard lights dimmed. Then he saw something in the ditch. He described 3 figures standing beside a fence. I asked whether they had been people. I guess, he said. They had coats on. That answer confused me. He said the figures were very tall and thin. They stood close together, facing the highway. Their coats reached below their knees. None of them moved as he passed. He did not see their faces. A quarter mile later, the fog cleared. The object was gone. The road looked normal, and his wipers started moving again without him touching the switch. He pulled into a closed gas station in Cedar Falls and checked his phone. The time was 11:48. He believed only 25 or 30 minutes had passed since he first noticed the light. Based on the time shown on his car clock before the radio failed, more than an hour had passed. He had no memory of stopping. He said he had checked the distance on his trip counter. He had driven the correct number of miles. There was no unexplained detour. That was where the recording ended. Aaron gave me his phone number and asked that we not use his last name on the air. I told him we would edit the interview and probably run it around 7:20. Before hanging up, he asked whether anyone else had called. I said no. He thanked me and ended the call. Dale came into the production room while I was saving the file. He had heard most of the interview through the monitor. Good one, he said. You think he made it up? Maybe. Didn't sound drunk. I replayed the part about the radio voice. The sentence was clear in Aaron's retelling. You should continue north. Dale leaned against the desk. Don't use the figures, he said. People will tune out once it gets too weird. I agreed. We planned to cut the recording to about 4 minutes and introduce it as an unexplained highway sighting. At 6:40, I went outside to smoke. The fog had thickened. I could barely see the tire shop sign across the access road. A dark sedan was parked at the far end of our lot. That was not unusual by itself. People sometimes used our lot to turn around or wait for the storage place to open. But the car had no lights on, and I could see 2 people sitting in the front. Neither of them moved while I stood outside. I finished my cigarette and went back in. At 6:52, the front door buzzer sounded. 2 men stood in the entryway. They wore dark overcoats and plain black suits. One was tall and narrow-faced. The other was shorter, with thick gray hair combed straight back. Both looked pale, though that might have been the fluorescent light. I asked how I could help them. The taller man said, "We need to hear the recording made this morning." He did not ask whether a recording existed. He did not mention Aaron's name. I said the station was not open to visitors until 8. The shorter man looked at the clock on the wall. His eyes moved from the clock to me. "We will not require much time," he said. His voice was flat and formal. He sounded like he was reading from prepared notes. I asked who they were. The tall man reached into his coat and showed me an identification wallet. He opened and closed it quickly. I saw a photograph, a blue seal, and several lines of print, but I could not read any of it. "Federal Communications Review," he said. I had never heard that phrase used as the name of an agency. I told them our manager was not in yet. The shorter man said, the caller described an aerial light pacing his vehicle north of Hudson for 19.4 miles. I stared at him. Aaron had said close to 20 miles. He had not given an exact distance. The man continued. He also reported a red light on the lower surface. I felt something tighten in my stomach. "There wasn't a red light," I said. Both men looked at me. The tall one tilted his head slightly. I explained that I had recorded the interview myself. Aaron had mentioned one white light and two amber lights. He had not mentioned red. The shorter man's expression did not change. The lower light was red, he said. It became visible when the object crossed the road. I went back over the interview in my head. Aaron had described the object crossing behind him, but he had never said anything about a lower light. I asked how they knew that. The tall man said, "Play the recording." Dale was in the studio reading headlines. I could see him watching us through the glass. I told the men I needed approval from management. The shorter man stepped closer to the reception counter. His overcoat was damp, but there were no drops of water on the floor beneath him. I noticed that both men wore identical black shoes. The shoes were clean, even though the parking lot was covered in salt and slush. "We are not asking to remove the recording," he said. "We are asking to hear it." I called our station manager, Marlene Reese. She answered on the third ring, sounding half awake. I explained that two men claiming to be federal officials wanted access to an unaired interview. She told me not to give them anything and said she was on her way. I hung up. The tall man glanced toward the production room. "That computer is not connected to the public broadcast system," he said. It was true. The editing computer was on a separate network. I asked whether they had been inside the station before. "No," he said. The shorter man added, "You saved 2 copies." I had saved the original audio and a working copy. I had not told Dale that. I had not told anyone. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The station felt strangely quiet, though music was playing through the wall speakers. I could hear the song, but it seemed distant, as if it were coming from another room. The tall man looked at me and said, "Mr. Voss was mistaken about the color. That error should not be broadcast." I asked again how he knew what Aaron saw. He ignored the question. Dale opened the studio door and came into the hall. He asked the men to leave. The shorter man turned toward him. "Your transmitter lost power for 11 seconds at 22:41 last night," he said. Dale looked at me. We had not known about any outage. The man gave the exact transmitter site number and named the backup unit we used. Then he said the backup had activated, but produced no signal. Dale told him that technical records were private. "They are not private," the tall man said. Marlene arrived about 10 minutes later. By then, the men had moved to the waiting area. They sat side by side without speaking, neither checked a phone or looked at a newspaper. They simply watched the hallway leading to the production room. Marlene asked to see their credentials. The tall man showed her the wallet. She held out her hand and asked to examine it. He closed it. She told them to leave or she would call the police. The shorter man stood. He looked at me and said, "Do not include the red light." I said, "There was no red light." He replied, "Not when he first noticed it." The two men walked out. Their sedan left the lot without turning on its headlights. It disappeared into the fog at the end of the access road. Marlene called the county sheriff's office. A deputy arrived around 7:30 and took down the description. He asked whether the men had threatened anyone or tried to force their way into a locked area. They had not. He checked the parking lot cameras. The sedan appeared on the rear camera when it entered, but its license plate was washed out by a bright patch in the image. That made no sense because its rear lights were off. The front camera showed the men walking toward the door. For 3 frames, the shorter man was already looking directly at the camera before he passed beneath it. We did not air Aaron's interview. Marlene wanted to verify his story first, but when I called the number he had given me, a woman answered. She said nobody named Aaron worked there and that the number belonged to a dental office in Waterloo. I checked the caller log. The original incoming number was listed as unavailable. Later that morning, Dale contacted the packaging plant Aaron had named. A supervisor confirmed that an Aaron Voss worked the night shift, but he had not been scheduled that week. When Dale asked to speak with him, the supervisor placed him on hold. After several minutes, another man answered and said Aaron no longer worked there. Dale asked when he had left. The man said, "This morning." At lunch, I reopened the recording. The file length had changed. The interview had originally lasted 12 minutes and 38 seconds. Now it lasted 12 minutes and 46 seconds. I played the final section. After Aaron thanked me, there were 8 seconds of silence that had not been there before. At first, I thought the added section was empty. Then I raised the volume. There was a low pulsing sound. Near the end, Aaron whispered something. I listened several times before I understood the words. He said, "The red one was underneath." I copied the file onto a flash drive and took it home. That evening, I called Aaron's number again. The dental office was closed, but the voicemail greeting had changed. A man answered in a flat, formal voice. He said, "You have reached a number that is no longer assigned." There was a pause, then he added, "Continue south." I disconnected and removed the battery from my phone. The next morning, I drove to work by a different route. I stayed off Highway 63 and took county roads through the western edge of town. A dark sedan followed me for 6 miles. It never came close enough for me to see the driver. It kept the same distance through every turn, even when I slowed down. When I reached the station, it continued past the entrance. I watched it in my mirror until it disappeared behind a line of grain silos. I made it home that evening before dark. The flash drive was still in the top drawer of my desk where I had left it. The file was gone. In its place was an audio file with no name. It lasted 19 seconds. For most of the recording, I heard the inside of my own car. The engine was running. The turn signal clicked. My breathing sounded close to the microphone. At the end, a man's voice spoke from the passenger seat. He said, "He did not drive beneath it." I noticed the first man in the picture of my tent. The photo had been taken on the second morning of a 3-day camping trip near Lake Quinault in Washington. I had set the camera on a flat rock and used the timer because I wanted one decent picture of myself at the site. I was standing beside the tent, holding a metal cup with the trees and part of the lake behind me. The man stood about 30 feet back, between 2 cedar trunks. He wore a black suit. At first, I thought it was a mark on the film. The photo had come from a disposable camera, and the drugstore had done a poor job with a few of the prints. There were scratches near the edges and a pale streak across one picture of the lake, but the shape between the trees was too clear. I could see a white shirt, a narrow dark tie, and one pale hand hanging beside his leg. His face was partly hidden by a branch. He seemed to be looking toward me. I sat at my kitchen table for several minutes, trying to remember anyone walking through the campsite that morning. There had been nobody. I had gone camping alone because my friend Marissa had canceled the day before. She had twisted her ankle at work, and I had already taken Friday off, so I went without her. The campground was quiet because it was late October. Most of the summer visitors were gone, and rain had been predicted all weekend. The site closest to mine had been empty. An older couple with a small trailer had stayed farther down the loop, but I only saw them once. They left Saturday morning. I went through the rest of the pictures. The second suited man appeared in a photo taken near the water. That picture had been from Friday evening. The sun was low, and there was a thin layer of mist over the lake. I had photographed my camp chair beside the shore because the light looked nice on the water. The man stood on the far right side of the frame. He was closer than the first one, maybe 15 feet from where I had been standing. He wore the same kind of suit and tie. He was tall and thin, with dark hair combed straight back. His arms hung close to his sides. His face was turned toward the camera. The print was grainy, but there was something odd about his expression. His mouth looked slightly open. His eyes were dark patches under his brow. I checked the date order on the envelope from the drugstore. The pictures were mixed up, so I sorted them on the table. There were 24 exposures. The first few showed the drive south from Seattle, the gas station where I stopped, and the sign at the campground entrance. Nothing unusual appeared in those. The men first showed up in a picture I had taken while unloading my car. One stood behind the open hatch of my Subaru, visible through the rear window. Only his head and shoulders showed. The other stood much farther away near the restroom building. I had not seen either of them. I remembered that part of the trip clearly because I had arrived later than planned. It was already getting dark, and a light rain had started. I had rushed to set up the tent before the ground got wetter. The campground host's office had been closed. No other cars passed while I unloaded. I found the men in 6 photographs altogether. Sometimes there was only one. sometimes both. They never stood in the same place twice. In one picture, a man appeared beyond my cooking table while I was heating soup. In another, he was reflected faintly in the driver's side window of my car. The reflection made it look as though he was standing right behind me. The most disturbing photo had been taken inside the tent. I had woken during the night and heard footsteps on the gravel. I had assumed it was a deer or raccoon. I found my camera near the sleeping bag and took a picture toward the tent door, mostly as a joke for Marissa. The flash lit the orange fabric, my boots, and the plastic zipper. Through the small mesh window, two pale faces were visible. They were side by side. One was higher than the other, as if the men were leaning down to look inside. I did not remember seeing the faces when the flash went off. I only remembered the footsteps stopping. After that, there had been a faint smell of cigarette smoke outside the tent. I had noticed it because the campground was damp, and the smell carried strongly. I thought it came from another site. I looked at the photograph until my eyes started hurting. Then I called Marissa. She came over after work. She studied the pictures without saying much. Marissa was not the kind of person who got excited about strange things. She worked in insurance claims and treated almost everything like a problem that could be documented. She asked whether I had met anyone at the campground. I told her no. She asked whether I might have photographed park employees. I pointed out the suits. Maybe there was a wedding nearby, she said. There were no event buildings near that section of the lake, and nobody would have walked through a wet campground in dress shoes. She used her phone to photograph the prints and enlarged them. The closer we looked, the worse they seemed. The men's suits looked almost identical. Both wore narrow black ties and white shirts buttoned all the way up. Neither wore a raincoat, even though the campground had been wet most of the weekend. Their shoes were visible in one picture. They were black and polished. There was no mud on them. Marissa noticed something else. In every photograph, both men's feet pointed directly toward the camera, even when their bodies were turned at an angle. We stopped looking for a while. I made coffee, and we sat in the living room with the prints face down on the table. Marissa asked whether anything else strange had happened during the trip. I told her about the footsteps. Then I remembered the car. On Saturday afternoon, I had driven to a small general store about 10 miles away because I had forgotten batteries for my flashlight. On the way back, a dark sedan followed me along South Shore Road. It was an older car, long and low, with square headlights. It stayed several car lengths behind me. At first, that did not bother me. There were few turnoffs, and anyone coming from the store would have been going the same direction. But when I slowed to let it pass, it slowed too. I pulled into a gravel viewpoint beside the lake. The sedan stopped on the shoulder about 100 yards back. I waited. Nobody got out. After a minute, I drove on. The sedan followed again. It disappeared before I reached the campground. I did not see where it turned. That evening, just before dark, I heard a low humming sound near the lake. It was not loud. It sounded like an electrical transformer far away. The sound continued for several minutes, stopped, then started again from a different direction. I had walked down to the shore to see if a boat was out there. The lake was empty. There were 3 small white lights above the opposite tree line. They formed a straight row and moved slowly from left to right. I thought they were aircraft until the middle light dropped below the other 2 and stayed there. A cloud covered them. When the cloud passed, the lights were gone. I had not thought much about it afterward. The weather was bad, and distances over the lake were hard to judge. Marissa asked why I had not told her. I said it had not seemed important until I saw the photographs. The next morning, I called the campground office. A man named Terry answered. I asked whether security cameras covered the camping loop. He said no. I asked if any employees wore black suits. He laughed and said most of them wore green jackets. I described the men. He became quiet. Then he asked which site I had used. I told him Site 14. There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Terry said, "You were there this past weekend?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." He asked whether I had left anything behind. I said I did not think so. He told me the campground was closed temporarily because of storm damage. I asked when it would reopen, probably next week. His voice sounded less friendly than before. I asked if anyone had reported men walking around the sites. He said no, and ended the call quickly. That should have been enough to keep me away, but I could not stop thinking about the pictures. I wanted to see the exact places where the men had stood. I thought there might be simple explanations. Maybe a maintenance road ran behind the trees. Maybe the angles were misleading. Maybe the men had been farther away than they appeared. Marissa offered to come with me, but she could not take time off until Friday. I waited 2 days. On Wednesday morning, the weather cleared. I left Seattle just after 7 and drove back toward Lake Quinault. The sky was gray, but the rain had stopped. Fog sat in the low areas beside the highway. I brought the photographs in a plastic folder along with my phone and a small can of pepper spray. The campground entrance was open. There was no sign about storm damage. The host office was still closed. A chain hung beside the door, but had not been pulled across the road. Only one vehicle was parked in the campground, a white pickup near the maintenance shed. I drove to Site 14. The site looked exactly as I remembered it. Wet gravel, a wooden table, a fire ring, and a path leading toward the lake. I parked and stayed in the car for a minute. Nothing moved in the trees. I took out the first photograph and walked to the place where I had set up my tent. Using the trees in the background, I found the spot where the first man had stood. There was nothing unusual there. The ground was covered with cedar needles and small ferns. I looked for footprints, but found only deer tracks and one deep mark from a boot. Then I noticed a cigarette butt beside a tree root. It looked fresh. The white paper was clean, and the filter had no dirt on it. A second cigarette butt lay about a foot away. Then a third. They had been placed in a straight line. I crouched down without touching them. All three had burned to exactly the same length. The ash ends were intact, even though the ground was damp. I checked the photograph. The line of cigarette butts marked the exact place where the sweeted man's shoes had been. I stood up and looked toward the road. My car was still the only one at the site. I moved to the next photograph, the one taken by the shore. The path was slick, and the lake was covered in pale fog. I could hear water dripping from the branches. I found the place where the second man had stood. 5 cigarette butts were arranged there in a narrow circle. The filters pointed inward. I did not understand why anyone would do that. I photographed them with my phone. When I raised the camera, the screen briefly showed a dark figure standing near the water. I lowered the phone. The shore was empty. I lifted it again. The figure was gone. I checked the picture I had just taken. It showed only fog, trees, and the cigarette butts. A car door closed somewhere uphill. I turned toward the campground. The sound had come from the direction of my site. I walked back quickly. A black sedan was parked behind my Subaru. It looked similar to the car that had followed me on Saturday, though I could not be sure. The hood was long, and the windows were dark. There was no front license plate. 2 men stood beside the picnic table. They wore black suits. From a distance, they looked almost exactly like the men in the photographs. One was tall and thin, with dark hair combed back. The other was shorter and wider through the shoulders. Both wore white shirts and narrow ties. Neither had a coat. The temperature was around 40 degrees. I stopped at the edge of the site. The taller man looked at the plastic folder in my hand. "You returned," he said. His voice was soft and flat. I asked who they were. The shorter man pointed toward the folder. "You had photographs processed on Monday." It was not a question. I said nothing. The taller man took one step toward me. His shoes made no sound on the gravel. "We need the original negatives," he said. I told him I did not have them with me. That was true. The negatives were in a drawer at home. The shorter man looked past me toward the path. "You disturbed the markers," he said. "I didn't touch anything." "You stood inside them." I thought about the circle of cigarette butts near the shore. I had stepped close while taking the picture, but I was fairly sure I had not crossed the line. I asked what the markers were for. Neither answered. The taller man looked at my car. "Is anyone expecting you?" I said yes. Marissa knew where I had gone. I had texted her when I reached the lake. The man nodded slowly, as if that changed something. The shorter man said, "You did not observe us during your stay." "No, you should continue not to observe us." The sentence sounded wrong, not threatening exactly. More like an instruction from someone who had learned English formally. I asked why they had been outside my tent. The shorter man's eyes moved toward me. Up close, his face looked oddly smooth. He had no visible beard shadow, wrinkles, or marks. His skin had a dull, gray tone. "We were not outside your tent," he said. I pulled out the photograph with the faces in the window. Both men looked at it. Neither seemed surprised. The taller man reached for the print. I stepped back. His expression changed slightly. His mouth tightened, but the rest of his face stayed still. "That image is incorrect," he said. I asked what that meant. He said, "The distance was greater." The shorter man turned his head sharply toward him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. A low humming sound started beyond the trees. Like it was the same sound I had heard Saturday evening. The taller man looked toward the lake. "We have little time," he said. The shorter man reached into his jacket and removed a white envelope. He placed it on the picnic table. "Leave the photographs," he said. "Take the envelope and return home." I did not move. The humming grew louder. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, but I felt it more than heard it. The picnic table vibrated slightly. The taller man looked past my shoulder. His face lost what little expression it had. I turned toward the lake. 3 pale lights were visible through the trees. They moved slowly above the water, level with the highest branches. The middle light hung lower than the others. I looked back at the men. They were walking toward their sedan. Neither hurried, but their movements looked stiff and unusually even, as though they were counting their steps. I got into my car. The black sedan backed away without its reverse lights coming on. It drove around the loop and disappeared behind the restroom building. I started the engine and followed. By the time I reached the entrance, the road was empty. I drove home without stopping. For the first 30 miles, I kept seeing a dark car, several vehicles behind me. Each time traffic changed, it disappeared. I reached my house a little after 2. The negatives were still in the kitchen drawer. I locked the doors and called Marissa. She came over that evening and stayed while I checked the photographs again. The white envelope had been on the passenger seat when I left the campground. I did not remember picking it up. Inside was a single photograph. It showed me standing near the lake that morning, holding my phone above the circle of Brett butts. The picture had been taken from behind the trees. Both suited men stood several feet behind me. A third person stood between them. The third person wore my green rain jacket. Marissa asked where the jacket was. I found it hanging by the back door. One pocket contained a fresh pack of cigarettes. I had never smoked. The next morning, I drove the negatives and every print to a bank and placed them in a safe deposit box. Then I went to work and stayed there until after dark. When I got home, my porch light was on. 2 cigarette butts had been placed side by side on the front step. A third lay several feet away, near the road. All 3 filters pointed toward my house. I found the marker around 10 in the morning, about 2 miles into a wooded parcel outside Ellsworth, Maine. I worked as a survey technician for Hancock County at the time. Most of my job involved checking old boundary descriptions, locating monuments, and updating records when roads or property lines changed. That day, I was helping with a dispute between a timber company and a family named Greeley. Both sides claimed a narrow strip of land along an abandoned logging road. It had rained hard the night before. The ground was soft, the trees were dripping, and fog still hung between the low hills. I was alone because my coworker Doug Mercer had called in sick. The work was routine, so I took the county truck, a metal detector, a range pole, marking tape, and a handheld GPS unit. The old deed mentioned an iron pin beside a large granite outcrop. I found the outcrop without much trouble, but there was no pin. I spent almost an hour sweeping the area with the detector and digging through wet leaves. At first, I thought the concrete marker was part of an old foundation. Only one corner showed above the ground. It was about 20 feet downhill from the granite outcrop under a patch of ferns. I scraped away the leaves with my boot and saw a flat gray surface. The concrete was smoother than the property monuments we usually found. Most old markers were rough, cracked, and shaped like narrow posts. This one looked more like the top of a buried box. I cleared more dirt from it with a small hand shovel. The exposed part formed a perfect square, 24 inches on each side. There was a brass disc set into the center. The disc had no county seal, state name, date, or survey number. It showed only a circle crossed by 3 straight lines. I had never seen that symbol before. I checked the county database on my tablet. No monument was recorded anywhere near that location. I also had scans of older USGS maps and timber surveys going back to the 1930s. None showed a structure, benchmark, utility line, or military boundary. The GPS gave me inconsistent coordinates. That happened in heavy tree cover, but the readings were worse than normal. The location jumped by 30 or 40 feet while I stood still. The compass arrow rotated slowly even after I recalibrated it. I walked uphill to the granite outcrop. The GPS settled down. When I returned to the marker, the screen started jumping again. I took several photographs with my work phone. One showed the full square and the brass disc. Another included the range pole for scale. I also photographed the surrounding trees and the slope toward the old logging road. While taking the pictures, I heard a tapping sound underground. It came from below the concrete. The sound was faint and regular. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 taps. I held still and listened. It repeated. I put my palm against the surface. The concrete felt colder than the wet ground around it. I could not feel any movement, but the tapping continued for another 10 seconds, then stopped. There were reasonable explanations. Water could have been dripping into an old drainage pipe. A loose stone could have been shifting. The area had once been heavily logged and buried equipment or culverts were common. I dug along one edge to see whether the marker was a post or slab. About 8 inches down, the side was still smooth concrete. I moved to another corner and got the same result. Whatever it was, it went deeper than an ordinary survey monument. That was when I noticed the soil. The ground around the marker was dark brown and full of roots. The soil directly against the concrete was pale gray, almost like ash. There were no roots growing through it. The difference formed a clean border about 6 inches wide. I collected a small amount in a sample bag. When I stood up, I saw movement between the trees uphill. I thought it was a person at first. Something dark passed behind a spruce trunk about 70 yards away. I called out. There was no answer. The land was private, but hunters and hikers sometimes crossed it. I waited, watching the trees. Nothing moved again. I returned to the marker and checked my phone. The time showed 11:17. That did not make sense. I had reached the granite outcrop shortly after 9. I had spent about an hour searching, maybe another 20 minutes, uncovering the marker. It should have been around 10:30. I checked the county truck's GPS log later. It showed me arriving at the trailhead at 8:42. I could not account for more than an hour. I assumed I had lost track of time while digging. It was easy to do when working alone. I packed the tools and started toward the logging road. I planned to eat lunch at the truck, then call my supervisor and ask whether anyone recognized the symbol. About halfway back, I found a line of orange survey tape tied to the trees. The tape was the same brand and color I carried, but I had not placed it there. Each strip was tied at eye level, spaced about 20 yards apart. The line led away from the road and deeper into the woods. I checked my vest. My roll of tape was still in the pocket and looked unused. I followed the line for a short distance because I thought another crew might have marked a boundary. After the 4th tree, the tape stopped. There was a shallow clearing ahead. The ground was covered with flattened ferns, and in the center were 2 narrow holes about the width of fence posts. Both holes were filled with black water. I pushed the range pole into one. It went down nearly 6 feet without touching bottom. A low humming sound started somewhere behind me. It was not loud. It reminded me of a truck idling far away, except the pitch stayed completely even. The hairs on my forearms lifted. I turned around and saw a pale light through the trees, back in the direction of the marker. It looked like sunlight reflecting from glass, but the sky was still overcast. The light moved slowly from left to right, stopped, then faded. I went back to the road without following the tape any farther. The county truck was where I had left it. The driver's door was unlocked. I always locked it in remote areas because the equipment inside was expensive. I was certain I had locked it that morning. Nothing appeared missing. There were 2 wet marks on the passenger seat, shaped like someone had rested gloved hands there. One was longer than the other. They did not look like prints from my gear. My work radio was on. The volume had been turned all the way down. I had switched it off before leaving the truck. I sat in the driver's seat and called my supervisor, Linda Bouchard. The signal broke up twice before the call connected. I told her I had found an unrecorded concrete monument near the disputed line. She asked for the coordinates. I read the most stable numbers from my field notes. There was a pause. She asked me to repeat them. When I did, she said, "That can't be right." I thought she meant the GPS reading. She said the coordinates placed me inside a county-owned parcel almost half a mile east of the Greeley property. I told her I had followed the deed description and had not crossed any fence or marked boundary. She asked whether I could send a photograph. I tried, but the image would not attach. The phone showed an error message saying the file type was unsupported, even though it was a normal photo. Linda told me to return to the office and bring the device with me. She wanted our mapping specialist to check it. Before I could start the truck, a black sedan came around the bend in the logging road. That road was barely wide enough for one vehicle. It had deep ruts, low branches, and several washed-out sections. I had driven it slowly in a four-wheel drive county truck. The sedan was an older full-size model with a long hood and narrow windows. It had no mud on its sides. It stopped about 20 feet in front of me. Two men got out. Both wore dark suits under black overcoats. The taller one had short brown hair and a long face. The other was heavier with gray hair cut very close to his head. Neither wore a hat despite water still dripping from the trees. I lowered my window a few inches. The taller man approached the driver's side. "Mr. Kelleher," he said. My last name was printed on the county identification clipped to my vest, so that alone did not bother me. I asked whether they needed help. He looked past me into the truck. "You located a concrete marker this morning." It was not a question. I asked who they were. The shorter man held up a leather identification wallet. He opened it briefly. I saw a photograph and a silver symbol, but no agency name I could read. The taller man said they were conducting a federal land review. I told him the parcel was involved in a local boundary dispute and that I had not been informed of any federal interest. He said, "The review is not part of the dispute." The shorter man walked to the front of the truck and studied the mud on the tires. Then he asked, "Did you measure its depth?" I said no. Both men looked at me. The taller man leaned slightly toward the window. "You did not determine the depth?" I exposed maybe 8 inches on two sides. I only photographed it. The shorter man's shoulders lowered. It was a small movement, but he looked disappointed. He asked whether I had used a steel probe. I said I had not. Ground penetrating equipment? No. Magnetic testing? No. I was looking for a property pin. The taller man glanced at the other man. "Then the disturbance was limited," he said. I asked what disturbance he meant. Neither answered. The shorter man came around to my side of the truck. Up close, his skin looked unusually pale. His coat was wet across the shoulders, but his hair was completely dry. "Show us the photographs," he said. I told him I had to submit them to the county office. "You may submit a written description. I need the photos for the record." "The photographs are inaccurate." I asked how he knew that without seeing them. He looked directly at me. The marker was not square. I had not told Linda the shape. I had only said concrete monument. I had not sent the images, and the two men had arrived before I reported anything beyond the coordinates. I asked again who they worked for. The taller man said, "Land Stabilization Office." I had never heard of it. I took my county phone from the dashboard but did not unlock it. The shorter man watched the screen. "You photographed the disc 4 times, he said. I had taken 5 pictures of the marker, but only 4 showed the brass disc clearly. I felt a tight pressure in my chest. I told them I was going back to the office and that they could contact my supervisor there. The taller man placed one hand on the roof of the truck. The humming sound returned. It seemed to come from under the road this time. The steering wheel vibrated lightly in my hands. "Did you remove material from beside the marker?" he asked. I said I had taken a soil sample. The two men became very still. The shorter man said, "Where is it?" I looked toward the sample bag in the passenger footwell without meaning to. He followed my eyes. I reached across, grabbed the bag, and held it up. The pale soil inside had changed color. It was now almost black. Moisture coated the inside of the plastic, although the sample had been dry when I collected it. A thin line had formed through the soil, dividing it into two equal sections. The taller man said, "That should remain here." I told him it belonged to the county investigation. "It does not belong to the county." "Then show me paperwork." He gave me a blank look, as if the request had not occurred to him. The shorter man stepped closer to the window. "Open the bag." I raised the window until only a narrow gap remained. He did not react. I started the engine. The shorter man moved in front of the truck, blocking the road. I put the transmission into reverse. The taller man took his hand off the roof. "You should not return to the marker," he said. I told him I had no intention of returning alone. "That is not what I said." I backed slowly down the logging road. The shorter man stayed in place until the truck had moved about 30 feet. Then he stepped aside. Neither man returned to the sedan. They stood in the road watching me reverse around the bend. I kept going backward until I reached a wider section where I could turn. When I faced forward again, the black sedan was gone. The road had no side tracks between that point and where they had parked. I drove past the spot and saw only fresh mud. There were no tire marks except mine. I did not stop. About a mile later, the county phone started ringing. The screen showed Linda's office number. When I answered, nobody spoke. I heard the same steady humming from the woods. Then a man's voice said, "You only photographed it." It sounded like the taller man. The call ended. I checked the recent call list. No call appeared. I reached the paved road around 1:30 and drove straight to the county office. Linda met me in the parking lot because she said my phone had been sending empty text messages every few minutes. The messages contained only coordinate pairs. None matched the location in my notebook. Our mapping specialist, Nathan Cole, loaded them into the computer. They formed a straight line running north through the forest for almost 14 miles. The final point ended in the middle of Graham Lake. I showed Linda the photographs. The first image showed the square concrete marker exactly as I remembered it. The second showed the brass disc. The third was blurred. The fourth and fifth showed only disturbed soil and ferns. The marker was not visible at all, even though the range pole appeared to be resting on its surface. Nathan zoomed in on the disc. The symbol had changed between the first and second pictures. In the first, 3 lines crossed the circle. In the second, there were 4. I took out the soil sample. The bag was empty. It was still sealed. There were no holes or tears. Moisture remained inside, but every grain of soil was gone. Linda contacted the sheriff's office and the State Land Survey Department. Nobody recognized the men or the agency name. The state surveyor checked historical records and aerial photographs. He found no structure or marker at the coordinates I had recorded. The next morning, Linda, Nathan, a deputy, and I went back in 2 vehicles. The logging road was blocked by a fallen pine that had not been there the day before. We parked and continued on foot. My orange tape still marked the path to the granite outcrop. The concrete marker was gone. The ground where it had been was covered with undisturbed moss. Nathan pushed a soil probe down nearly 4 feet without hitting anything. The shallow clearing with the 2 water-filled holes was gone too. The area was thick with waist-high brush that could not have grown overnight. We searched until early afternoon. On the walk back, the deputy found 2 cigarette butts beside the logging road. They were placed parallel to each other on a flat stone. The paper was dry, even though rain had started again. I completed my report at the county office. Linda attached the photographs, the incorrect coordinates, and statements from everyone who returned to the site. The boundary dispute was eventually settled using an older iron pin found farther south. I was reassigned to road surveys for the rest of that season. 3 weeks later, I received a plain envelope at work. There was no return address or postmark. Inside was one of my photographs of the marker, printed on heavy paper. Someone had drawn a vertical line beside the concrete block. A measurement was written in black ink, 41 FT 8 in. Below it were 2 words, "Not confirmed." I took the letter to Linda. She added it to the file and contacted the deputy again. Nothing came from it. That evening, I drove home before dark. My wife, Callie, was cooking dinner, and our 2 dogs were asleep near the kitchen heater. I changed out of my wet clothes and put my work boots by the back door. A small amount of pale gray soil fell from the right boot. It formed a clean circle on the floor. In the center was a thin brass disc about the size of a quarter. It had no writing on it. 4 straight lines crossed its surface. I heard the first knock at 11:26 on a Tuesday night. I knew the exact time because I had just looked at the clock on my truck dashboard before getting out. My dog Benny had started whining near the back door, and when I let him into the yard, he would not leave the porch. He stood there with his ears up, staring toward the old power substation across the county road. I lived outside Scottsbluff, Nebraska, in a small house that had belonged to my parents. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. The substation sat on a fenced gravel lot beside a row of cottonwoods. It had been unused since the utility company built a larger one closer to town about 12 years earlier. I had worked as an electrician for 34 years, the last 9 with the county. I had been inside enough substations to know the sounds they made. Transformers hummed, relays clicked, loose panels rattled in the wind. An empty substation did not knock. The sound came again while I stood by the porch. 3 hard knocks. 3 hard knocks, not metal banging in the wind. It sounded like someone hitting the inside of a steel door with a tool. I waited. The night was warm and dry, with almost no breeze. There was lightning far to the north, but no thunder. The substation was a dark shape behind the fence. 17 seconds later, the knocks came again. I did not count the first gap on purpose. I only noticed the timing because the second set came just as I was about to go back inside. I looked at my watch and waited. 17 seconds, 3 knocks. Benny backed toward the door and scratched at it. I let him inside, grabbed a flashlight, and drove across the road. That sounds foolish now, but the station had been broken into before. Teenagers used the lot to drink, and copper thieves had cut the outer fence twice. Even abandoned electrical sites could be dangerous. Some equipment remained connected to grounding systems, and there were open cabinets and old oil pits. The chain on the front gate was in place, but the padlock hung open. I had seen the utility crew replace that lock the previous spring. It was not broken. The shackle had been opened with a key. I stayed outside the fence and shined my flashlight across the gravel. No vehicles, no footprints that I could see. No movement. The main control building stood near the center of the lot. It was a low concrete structure with 1 steel door and 3 narrow windows. All the windows had been covered from the inside with plywood. The knocking came again. It came from inside that building. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. I called out that the property was closed. Nobody answered. I checked my watch. 17 seconds later, the sound repeated. I called the sheriff's non-emergency number. The dispatcher said the nearest deputy was handling a rollover west of town and might take a while. She asked if I could see anyone. I said no. She told me not to enter the property. I agreed, but I stayed by the gate. The knocking continued. After the 6th or 7th set, I noticed a low tone beneath it. It was barely audible, more like pressure in my ears than sound. It reminded me of standing near a live transformer, except this station had no operating transformer. I walked along the fence toward the south side. The tone grew stronger near the control building. My flashlight dimmed. I slapped it against my palm, and the beam returned. The batteries were new. One of the narrow windows had a gap in the plywood covering. It was only an inch wide. A faint white light showed through it. I had never seen power in that building since it was decommissioned. I moved closer to the fence. The light inside shifted from left to right. Then something crossed the gap. It looked like a person passing between the window and a light source. I saw a narrow, dark shape, shoulder height, moving slowly. I called out again. The knocking stopped. For the first time, I became aware of how quiet the area was. No insects, no traffic. Even the cottonwood leaves were still. I backed away from the fence. My truck engine died. The headlights stayed on, but the engine shut off as cleanly as if someone had turned the key. I was standing 10 feet away from it with the keys in my pocket. The headlights dimmed, brightened, then went out. A pale light appeared above the control building. At first, I thought it was heat lightning behind the clouds. Then I saw that the light was below the cloud line, hanging maybe 50 feet above the roof. It was round and white with no beam under it. It moved a few feet to the side and stopped. The knocking began again. This time it came from below the gravel near where I stood. 3 dull impacts rose through the ground. I felt them through my boots. I stepped back into the road. The light above the building went out. My truck headlights came on by themselves. The engine restarted, even though the key was still in my hand. I got in and drove home. I locked the doors, called the dispatcher again, and told her the gate was open and there might be someone inside. I did not mention the light. I said I had heard noises and my truck had stalled. A deputy named Travis Monroe arrived at 12:18. I met him in my driveway and walked across the road with him. The gate was locked. The padlock was closed through the chain. Travis tested it and shined his light across the lot. The gravel looked undisturbed. I told him I had seen the lock hanging open less than an hour earlier. He asked whether I had gone inside. I said no. We stood there for about 10 minutes. No knocking came from the building. Travis wrote down my name and said he would contact the utility company. He was polite, but I could tell he thought I had heard loose metal or an animal. Before leaving, he asked what time the noise started. I told him 11:26. He wrote it down. I went back inside and checked on Benny. He was under the kitchen table. I did not sleep much. Around 2 in the morning, I heard 3 soft taps from the wall behind my bed. I sat up and listened. 17 seconds passed. 3 more taps. I moved to the living room and stayed there with the television on until sunrise. The next morning, I called the utility office and asked for Harold Finch, an old supervisor I had known through work. Harold said the station had been disconnected from the distribution line years ago. The control building still contained some relay cabinets, but there was no active power feed. He asked why. I told him about the knocking and the light in the window. He said he would send a crew to check the gate and building. At 9:30, a dark sedan pulled into my driveway. It was an older full-size car, black or very dark blue. The body was clean, but the paint looked dull. There was no front license plate. 2 men got out. Both wore dark suits, white shirts, and black ties. The taller one had gray hair cut close to his head. The other was younger, maybe 40, with a wide face and black hair parted neatly on the left. Neither carried tools. I met them on the porch. The tall man asked if I was Raymond Keller. I said yes. He said they were following up on an electrical disturbance at the old substation. I assumed Harold had sent them, though they did not look like utility workers. I asked who they were with. The younger man opened a black identification wallet. He held it up for a second. I saw his photograph, a silver seal, and several lines of print, but I could not read the agency name. Regional Infrastructure Review, he said. I had never heard of it. The tall man looked across the road. You heard the sound at 23:26, he said. Not around 11:30. Not last night, the exact minute. I asked how he knew that. He said the event was logged. I asked by whom. He ignored the question. The younger man asked whether the sound came from the control building or the transformer yard. I said it came from the building at first. At first? He asked. I told him it later seemed to come from beneath the gravel. The 2 men looked at each other. The tall man said, "Did the sound repeat every 17 seconds?" I had not told anyone that. Not the dispatcher. Not Travis. Not Harold. I had only written the timing in a notebook on my kitchen counter after the deputy left. I asked why he said 17 seconds. He answered, "Was the interval exact?" I said it seemed exact. "How many repetitions?" "I don't know, maybe 8 or 9. The younger man stepped closer. "Did it continue after you returned to the residence?" I thought about the tapping behind my bed. I said no. He watched me for several seconds. His eyes were unusually dark. The pupils and irises almost blended together. The tall man asked if I had entered the station. I said I had stayed outside the fence. "Did you touch the gate?" "No." "Did you touch the lock?" "No." "Did you place either hand on the fence?" I remembered leaning close to the south side, but I did not think I had touched it. I said I might have brushed it. The younger man looked at my hands. "Which hand?" I held up my right hand. He asked me to turn it over. There was a faint gray line across my palm. I thought it was dirt or grease. I rubbed it with my thumb, but it did not come off. The line ran from the base of my index finger to my wrist. It was perfectly straight. The younger man did not touch me. He only leaned closer and looked. "It did not break the skin," he said. I pulled my hand back. I asked again who they worked for. The tall man said, "The station is not abandoned." I told him it had been unused for over a decade. Unused is not abandoned, he said. The younger man asked whether I had seen any animals near the fence. I said my dog had reacted to the noise but stayed at the house. Birds? It was almost midnight. Did you observe birds? No. He nodded, and some tension seemed to leave his face. The tall man asked about the light above the building. I had not mentioned that either. I said, "What light?" "The white light at approximately 2341. I felt cold despite the heat on the porch. I asked whether there had been surveillance equipment at the station. He said not equipment you would recognize. The younger man turned sharply toward him. The tall man did not react. I told them I wanted names and an office number before answering anything else. The tall man reached into his jacket and handed me a plain white card. It said Martin Vale in black letters. Beneath the name was a phone number with a Washington, D.C. area code. No agency, no title. The younger man did not give me a card. I asked whether they wanted to inspect the station. "We already have," Vale said. I had been looking out the front window most of the morning. No one had entered the property. I asked when. He said, "Before the sound was reported." The younger man looked across the road. A utility truck was approaching from the east. Vale took the card back out of my hand. He had moved so quickly I did not see him reach for it. "We will contact you if the interval changes," he said. I asked what that meant. Neither answered. They walked to the sedan. As the younger man opened the passenger door, he looked back at me. 17 seconds is normal, he said. The sedan backed out and drove west. The utility truck arrived less than a minute later. Harold was in the passenger seat with a younger technician named Luis Garza. I asked whether they had passed the black car. Harold said no. The road was straight for nearly a mile in both directions. There was nowhere the sedan could have turned without being visible. We crossed to the substation. The gate was locked. Harold opened it with a utility key. Inside, the gravel showed tire tracks from the last maintenance visit, but no fresh footprints. We walked to the control building. The steel door was secured with a heavy padlock. Harold unlocked it. The room smelled like dust and old insulation. Most of the cabinets had been emptied. A workbench stood against one wall, and dead insects covered the floor near the windows. There was no light source. The plywood over the window had not been disturbed. Luis checked the remaining panels with a voltage tester. Everything was dead. I showed them where I had seen the light and heard the knocking. Behind the workbench was a steel access panel in the floor. I remembered it from years earlier. It covered a cable trench running beneath the building. Harold removed the bolts. The panel lifted only a few inches before something below stopped it. We shined flashlights through the gap. A thick black cable filled the trench. Harold said it did not belong there. The original power cables had been removed when the station closed. This one looked new. It was wider than my wrist and disappeared into the concrete on both ends. There were no markings on its outer casing. Luis placed a clamp meter around it. The meter displayed 0. Then it jumped to 17. Not 17 amps, just as the number 17 with no unit beside it. The screen went blank. A knock came from below us. 3 hard impacts. Luis dropped the meter. Harold checked his watch. 17 seconds later, the knock repeated. We left the building and locked it. Harold called his supervisor from the truck. He described the cable and asked whether another agency had installed equipment at the site. His supervisor put him on hold. When he came back, his voice had changed. He told Harold to leave the property immediately and not document the cable. Harold asked why. The supervisor repeated the instruction and ended the call. We returned to my house. The gray line on my palm had darkened. Luis took a picture of it with his phone. The camera would not focus. Every image showed my hand as a pale blur. Harold asked about the 2 men. I gave him their descriptions and the name Martin Vale. He called the number from memory because I no longer had the card. A recorded voice said the number was not in service. That afternoon, Harold called me from the utility office. He said there was no record of regional infrastructure review and nobody named Martin Vale worked with their state or federal contacts. He also said the maintenance crew had returned to the substation after lunch with a supervisor. The cable trench was empty. The bolts on the floor panel had been painted over years earlier and showed no sign of being removed. Harold asked whether I was sure we had opened it. I reminded him that Luis had dropped his meter into the trench. There was a long pause. Harold said Luis's meter was back in the truck, undamaged. I stayed with my daughter in town that evening. I did not want to be alone across from the station. Benny came with me and acted normal as soon as we left my property. I returned home the next morning after sunrise. The substation looked the same as always. The gray line on my palm had faded. I went inside, made coffee, and checked the voicemail on my house phone. There was one new message. The caller had not left a number. For the first 16 seconds, the recording was silent. Then there were 3 knocks. A man spoke quietly after them. He said, "The interval has not changed." I deleted the message and unplugged the phone. That night, I slept in the living room with the television on. At 11:26, 3 knocks came from inside the wall behind the couch. I watched the clock. The next set came 18 seconds later. I first saw the fog at 5:40 on a Sunday morning in late May. I was a volunteer weather observer for a small station outside La Crosse, Wisconsin. The equipment sat behind my house on a few acres of former pasture near the edge of town. I recorded temperature, rainfall, wind, cloud cover, and anything unusual, then sent the readings to the regional office before 7. That morning had started clear and cool. The temperature was 49 degrees, the grass was wet with dew, and there was almost no wind. I could see the bluffs across the valley and the red lights on the radio towers several miles away. The fog was in the north field. At first, I thought it was smoke from someone burning brush. It looked like a low white mass beyond the fence, maybe 200 yards from my weather station. Then I noticed the shape. It was a perfect circle. I do not mean roughly round. The edge curved evenly all the way around, like someone had placed a white disc upright in the field. It was about 50 feet across and maybe 12 feet high. The top was flat enough that I could see clear sky above it. Nothing else nearby was foggy. The grass between my house and the patch was clear. The ditch along County Road B was clear. The low ground near the creek where fog usually collected was clear too. I watched it for a minute, expecting it to spread. It did not move. I checked the wind gauge. The cups were turning slowly from the west at 3 miles per hour. The branches on the cottonwoods moved a little in the same direction. The fog remained still. I wrote "localized ground fog north field" in my notebook and took a picture with my phone. The image looked normal, except the fog seemed flatter than it had in person. It looked almost like a white wall. The trees behind it were completely hidden, but the grass in front was sharp and clear. I went inside and checked the weather radar. There was no rain within 100 miles. The satellite image showed clear skies over most of western Wisconsin. The local traffic camera on the highway also showed good visibility. I refreshed the page several times. Nothing appeared over my property. That was not surprising by itself. Radar did not usually show fog well. Still, I checked the airport observation in La Crosse. Visibility there was 10 miles. I went back outside at 6. The fog had not changed. The sun had started coming up behind the trees and the field was brighter. The patch cast a shadow. That was the first part I could not explain. Fog normally softens sunlight. This blocked it. A dark area stretched from the western edge of the circle across the grass, like the shadow of a solid building. I walked closer. The north field belonged to my neighbor, Wayne Keller. He used it for hay and rarely went out there before June. There was a wire fence between our properties, but no animals. As I reached the fence, I noticed a low sound. It was steady and faint, similar to the hum from a distant grain dryer. I could feel it more clearly when I leaned against the metal post. The post vibrated. I stepped away and the feeling stopped. The edge of the fog was about 40 yards beyond the fence. From that distance, I could see slow movement inside it. Dark bands passed from left to right, then disappeared. I thought they were trees showing through thinner sections. Then one of the bands moved against the wind. It crossed the center of the fog and stopped near the left edge. Another followed it. Both were tall and narrow. I took another picture. On the phone screen, the dark shapes did not appear. The fog was an even blank circle. I called Wayne. He answered, sounding half asleep. I asked if he had started any equipment in the field or sprayed anything recently. He said no. I asked whether I could walk onto his property and look at something. "What is it?" he asked. I told him there was a strange patch of fog near the cottonwoods. He looked out his bedroom window while we were still on the phone. "I don't see fog," he said. His house was east of the field, less than half a mile away. From his upstairs bedroom, he should have had a clear view. I told him exactly where it was. He said he saw the trees and the old feed shed, but no fog. I was looking directly at it while he spoke. I asked him to drive over. He said he would get dressed and come around. I waited beside the fence. A small group of starlings flew out of the cottonwoods. They moved toward the fog, then changed direction all at once about 20 feet before reaching it. The entire group turned sharply south. A minute later, two crows approached from the west. They did the same thing, neither crossed the edge. That made me uneasy enough that I stopped thinking about going closer. Wayne arrived in his pickup around 6:20. He parked beside my garage and walked out to the weather station. By then, the fog had been there at least 40 minutes. He saw it immediately from my yard. "That wasn't there from my house," he said. I asked what he meant. He said the field looked clear from the east side. He had driven along County Road B and seen nothing until he turned into my driveway. We walked to the fence together. The humming was still there. Wayne touched the post and pulled his hand away. "Electric fence?" he asked. It was not electric. The wire had not been connected to anything in years. We followed the fence line west, keeping the patch in sight. The shape remained circular from every angle. It should have looked thinner as we moved around it, but it did not. It always seemed to face us directly. Wayne noticed that before I said anything. "That thing's turning," he said. I told him I thought it only looked that way because we had no good sense of distance. He picked up a small stone and threw it over the fence. The stone landed in the grass well short of the fog. The sound came back late. I saw it hit, then heard the soft thud about 2 seconds afterward. Wayne looked at me. He threw another stone, harder this time. It passed into the fog. We did not hear it land. The humming stopped. The silence was immediate. Birds, insects, distant traffic, everything seemed to drop out at once. Wayne said we should go inside. Before we moved, something pressed against the fog from within. The surface bulged outward at about chest height. It did not break through. The shape was broad and rounded, like someone pushing a shoulder against fabric. It held for several seconds, then it slowly pulled back. The normal sounds returned all at once. A truck passed on the county road. A dog barked somewhere beyond the trees. Wayne walked quickly toward the house. I followed him. At 6:37, I took another observation. The temperature had risen 2 degrees. The wind remained from the west. The fog had not moved. I called the regional weather office. A technician named Marla Jensen answered. I had spoken with her several times about damaged equipment and unusual readings. I described the patch and asked whether anyone else had reported local fog. She checked nearby stations. Nothing. She asked if it could be steam from a broken irrigation line or manure pit. I told her there were no pipes or buildings in that part of the field. She asked for pictures. I emailed 3. While she waited for them, she checked a visible satellite feed and an airport camera facing north. She said the whole area looked clear. Then she received the pictures. For several seconds, she said nothing. Finally, she asked, "Is that edited?" I told her no. She said the patch looked too sharply defined to be normal fog. She suggested I record the duration, wind, and temperature around it, but not enter the field. I told her I had no plan to enter it. At 7:10, Wayne went home to check the view from his property again. He called me from his driveway. The fog was still invisible from there. I walked along the road while he stayed on the phone. There was a point about 100 yards east of my driveway where the patch disappeared. It did not fade. One step, it was there. Another step, the field looked empty. I moved back and forth several times. From the west side, I saw the fog. From the east side, I saw the cottonwoods and grass behind the exact same area. Wayne stood on the far side of the field and waved at me. When I moved west, the fog blocked him. When I moved east, I saw him clearly. He drove back to my house and refused to go near the fence again. Around 8, the patch began to shrink. The edges moved inward evenly. It kept its circular shape the whole time. Within 10 minutes, it was about half its original size. The grass beneath it looked darker. At 8:14, the fog collapsed into a narrow white column. The column became thinner until it looked like a person standing upright in the field. Then it disappeared. The field was empty. Wayne and I waited another 20 minutes before walking out there. The grass inside the circle was wet, but not with dew. The moisture had a greasy feel and left a faint gray mark on my fingertips. The rest of the field had dried in the sun. In the exact center was a shallow depression about 6 feet across. The grass had been pressed flat in a clockwise pattern. There were no footprints leading in or out. We found the stone Wayne had thrown. It lay near the middle of the depression. It was warm. I collected it in a plastic bag and took soil temperature readings. Inside the circle, the ground was 58 degrees. Outside, it was 51. I sent the final observations to Marla. She called back and asked me to write a separate incident report. She said the photos had been forwarded to someone in the regional office. By noon, the pressed grass had started lifting again. I thought that was the end of it. At 3:30 that afternoon, a black car pulled into my driveway. It was an older sedan, clean but dull, with no front license plate. 2 men got out. They wore dark suits and black ties. One was tall with close-cut gray hair. The other was shorter and heavy through the shoulders. Neither carried a briefcase or wore an identification badge. I met them near the porch. The taller man asked if I was Gordon Hale. I said yes. He told me they were following up on an atmospheric observation. I asked if Marla had sent them. He said, "The regional office informed us." That sounded possible, though they had arrived quickly for people from any government office I knew. The shorter man looked past me toward the north field. "The formation occurred between 5:38 and 8:16, he said. My first picture was time-stamped 5:42. I had estimated seeing it at 5:40. I had not recorded 5:38 anywhere. I asked who they worked for. The taller man opened a black wallet. He showed it briefly. There was a photograph, a silver seal, and several lines of small print. I could not read the agency name before he closed it. "Environmental Survey Division," he said. I had never heard of it. They asked to see the location. I told Wayne by phone that I was taking 2 investigators to the field. I wanted someone else to know they were there. The men waited without speaking while I made the call. When we reached the fence, the shorter man placed his palm on the same metal post that had vibrated earlier. He kept it there for a long time. "It has ended," he said. The taller man asked me to describe the fog from the beginning. I did. He listened without taking notes. The shorter man walked along the edge of the flattened circle. He counted his steps under his breath. At the center, he crouched and touched the grass with 2 fingers. When I mentioned the humming sound, both men looked at me. When I mentioned the lost sound after Wayne threw the stone, the taller man asked whether I had experienced pressure in my ears. I said no. He asked whether my watch had stopped. I checked my notes. My watch had been 6 minutes slow when I came inside, but it was an old digital watch and sometimes lost time. The shorter man asked, "Did any birds enter the fog?" The question seemed oddly specific. I told him birds had approached but turned away. He stood up. "None entered?" "No." "Not even briefly?" "No." He looked at the taller man. Whatever they had come to ask, that answer seemed to settle it. The taller man thanked me. I asked why the birds mattered. He said they are sensitive to pressure changes. I told him the barometer had remained steady. He did not respond. The shorter man asked whether any person had entered. I said no. "Any livestock?" There was no livestock in the field. "Domestic animals?" "No." He nodded. They began walking back toward the house. I followed and asked whether they wanted copies of the photographs or my written report. The taller man said they already had both. I had sent the report only to Marla. I asked how they got it. He looked ahead and said, "You sent it through the proper channel." At the car, the shorter man turned toward me. He asked whether I had collected anything from the circle. I did not want to mention the stone, so I said I had taken only temperature measurements. He watched my face. "Nothing was removed?" "No." He stepped closer. His skin looked pale in the afternoon light, almost gray around the mouth. There were small drops of moisture on his suit jacket even though the day was dry. He said, "That was appropriate." The 2 men got into the sedan. The engine started quietly. They backed out and drove east toward the section of road where the fog had not been visible. I went inside and called Marla. She had not sent anyone. She said nobody from the regional office would visit a volunteer station without calling first. She asked for descriptions of the men and their car. While we spoke, I checked the driveway camera. The car appeared clearly. The two men did not. The video showed both doors opening, but nobody stepped out. The picture jumped forward 12 seconds, and then I appeared walking from the porch toward the empty car. Marla told me to save the footage. I copied it to my computer and called the county sheriff's office. A deputy named Colin Reeves arrived around 5. He watched the video twice. He checked the road cameras and found a black sedan heading east at 3:58. The rear plate was unreadable because a bright reflection covered it in every frame. Colin walked to the field with me. The circle was almost gone, but the grass in the center remained pressed down. I showed him the place where the shorter man had crouched. There were 2 cigarette butts lying side by side. Neither man had smoked while they were with me. The butts were dry and freshly burned. The ash had not fallen off. Colin collected them in an evidence bag. I remembered the stone and took it from my garage. The plastic bag had fogged inside. When I opened it, a smell like wet metal came out. The stone was cold now, much colder than the room. Colin asked where I found it. I told him everything, including the fact that I had lied to the men about removing it. He placed it in a second evidence bag. At that exact moment, a flock of starlings crossed above the field. Every bird turned sharply around the center of the old circle. Colin saw it too. He stayed until after sunset and then followed me into town while I had dinner at my sister's house. I returned home around 10. The field looked normal in the headlights. Nothing followed me, and the house was locked. The next morning, the stone was sitting on top of my rain gauge. The evidence bag was gone. I called Colin. He said the stone was still sealed inside the evidence locker at the sheriff's office. I did not touch the one on the rain gauge. At 5:38, a narrow band of fog formed around it. A sparrow landed on the fence nearby. It watched the fog for several seconds, then flew in the opposite direction. The 2 men came in a little after 1 in the morning, while I was restocking cigarettes behind the counter. I worked the overnight shift at a truck stop off Interstate 70, about 20 miles west of Salina, Kansas. It was one of those older places that had been remodeled in sections over the years. The restaurant side closed at midnight, but the fuel desk, store, and showers stayed open all night. That evening had been hot and windy. A line of storms was moving in from the west, but the rain had not reached us yet. Lightning kept flashing behind the grain elevators across the highway. The air smelled like dust and hot pavement every time the automatic doors opened. There were only 3 customers inside when the men arrived. A driver named Leon was drinking coffee near the window. Another driver was in the shower hall, and a woman with 2 kids was looking at snacks. The men walked in together. Both wore dark suits, white shirts, and narrow black ties. They did not have jackets over their suits, even though the wind outside was blowing hard enough to move shopping carts across the lot. The taller man looked around the store. The shorter one came straight to the counter. He had light brown hair combed flat against his head. His face was pale and smooth, and he looked anywhere from 40 to 60. I could not decide. The taller man had gray hair and a long, wet, narrow face. Neither one had any dust on his shoes. The shorter man asked, "Have any drivers complained about the lights over exit 41? He said it like we had already been talking about it. I asked what lights he meant. The lights above the exit, he said. Exit 41 was about 7 miles east of us. There was not much there. Just a county road, a closed way station, and a line of utility poles running north. I told him nobody had mentioned lights. The taller man looked toward Leon. "Are you certain?" he asked. I said I had been there since 10, had not heard anything. The shorter man placed both hands on the counter. His fingers were long and very clean. He asked whether any drivers had reported trouble with their radios, watches, or engines near the exit. That question bothered me because I had heard something like that earlier. Around midnight, a cattle hauler named Mitch Danner had come in for fuel. He said his dashboard lights had dimmed near exit 41, and his CB had picked up a steady tone that lasted almost a minute. He blamed the storm. Mitch had also mentioned 3 white lights above the closed way station. He thought they were helicopters until they moved into a straight vertical line. I had not taken him seriously. Drivers said strange things when they had been on the road too long. I did not tell the suited men. I said, "No complaints." The shorter man stared at me for a few seconds. His eyes did not move much. He seemed to look at my whole face instead of meeting my eyes. Then he said, "One driver stopped here at 12:06. Mitch's fuel receipt had printed at 12:06. I asked how he knew that. The taller man moved closer to the counter. He was operating a red livestock vehicle, he said. I looked through the front windows. The parking lot was mostly empty, and Mitch had left almost an hour earlier. There was no way they could have seen his truck unless they had been nearby at the time. I asked whether they were police. The shorter man reached into his shirt pocket and showed me a card. It looked like an identification card, but he held it low and took it back before I could read anything. I saw a black and white photograph and a circular seal. Transportation review, he said. That was all. The taller man asked, "What did the driver tell you?" I said he complained about his radio cutting out. The shorter man nodded once. And the lights? I had not mentioned the lights. I felt my stomach tighten. I asked again who they worked for. The taller man looked toward the ceiling above me. One of the fluorescent tubes had started flickering. It was the same light that always acted up during humid weather, but it had not flickered before they came in. "We are trying to determine whether the event was observed from the ground," he said. I told him I did not know what event he meant. The shorter man asked for 2 packs of unfiltered cigarettes. We did not carry many, but I found 2 packs in the bottom row. He put them on the counter and gave me a $20 bill. The bill was perfectly flat. It felt different from normal money. Not fake, exactly. The paper was rougher and thicker. I held it under the light and checked the watermark. There was no modern watermark strip. I looked at the date. The bill had been printed in 1934. I told him I could not take it. "It is valid currency," he said. I explained that old bills sometimes needed a manager's approval, especially when they looked collectible. He placed a second bill beside it. That one was a 10 from 1950. Both looked brand new. No folds, stains, or worn corners. They looked like they had come directly from a printing press. I asked whether he had anything newer. The shorter man looked at the taller one. The taller man said, "These were issued correctly." His tone made the woman near the snack aisle look over. I did not want an argument, so I accepted the 20 and gave them change. The register did not reject it because we did not have an automatic bill scanner at that counter. The shorter man took the cigarettes but left the change. He asked, "Did the driver say the lower light was red?" I remembered Mitch's exact words. He had said there were 3 white lights above the way station. Then, when he looked in his mirror, he saw a red light moving along the fence beside the road. I had not told anyone that. I said, "He didn't mention a red light." The man watched me for another moment. Then he said, "He did." Leon stood up from the table near the window and carried his coffee to the counter. He knew something was wrong. Leon was a regular on my shift and had a habit of stepping closer whenever a customer gave me trouble. He asked the men whether they needed directions. The taller man turned toward him. "What time did you pass exit 41?" he asked. Leon frowned. "I didn't. You approached from the east. I came down from Nebraska." The taller man said, "Not tonight." Leon gave me a look. The shorter man asked him whether he had seen lights above the road. Leon said no. The 2 men studied him in silence. Then the taller man said, "You stopped beneath them for 11 minutes. Leon set his cup down. He told them they had him confused with somebody else. The shorter man looked at Leon's left hand. There was a dark mark on his thumb, like grease or ink. "You touched the fence," he said. Leon pulled his hand back. The woman with the children left the store without buying anything. The automatic doors opened and the hot wind rushed in. A stack of paper cups near the soda machine fell over. The taller man watched her cross the parking lot. "You should close the west entrance," he said to me. I told him we only had 1 customer entrance. He looked toward the locked restaurant doors. "The west entrance," he repeated. That side of the building faced south. I said nothing. The shorter man picked up the cigarettes. Both men left without another word. They walked across the lot toward a black sedan parked near the diesel pumps. I had not seen it pull in. It was an older car, long and square, with dull paint and narrow tires. The parking lot lights reflected strangely on its windows. I could see the shapes of the pumps behind it, but I could not see inside the car. They got in. The sedan started without any visible exhaust and drove toward the interstate. Its headlights remained off until it reached the entrance ramp. Leon stood beside me watching it leave. He asked, "What was that about?" I told him about Mitch's story. Leon's face changed. He looked down at his thumb. The dark mark was still there. He said he had stopped near exit 41 earlier that night because he thought one of his trailer tires was low. He had walked around the truck with a flashlight and leaned against the fence beside the old way station. He did not remember seeing any lights. I asked how long he stopped. He checked his electronic log. There was a 14-minute gap in his driving time. He said the inspection should have taken 3 or 4 minutes. His truck clock had been 11 minutes behind when he reached the stop, but he assumed the clock was wrong. Neither of us knew what to say after that. Around 2:30, the storm finally reached the truck stop. Rain hit the windows so hard I could not see the fuel pumps. The power blinked twice, and the backup lights came on in the hallway. The phone rang. I answered with the usual greeting. Nobody spoke. I heard a steady humming sound, low and smooth. It lasted several seconds. Then a man said, "The lower light was red." The voice sounded like the shorter man. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. This time, the caller ID showed the truck stop's own number. I let it ring. The fluorescent light above the register started flickering again. It went dark for maybe 2 seconds. When it came back, the 2 packs of cigarettes were on the counter. They were still sealed. The change I had given the man sat beside them in a neat stack. The old $20 bill was gone from the register drawer. I checked the security camera monitor. The camera above the counter showed me standing there alone. The time in the corner read 2:34. I rewound the footage to 1 in the morning. The 2 men never appeared. The front doors opened by themselves. I talked to an empty counter for about 6 minutes. Leon came over and stood beside me. Then the doors opened again. The black sedan did appear on the outside camera. It was parked near the diesel pumps for exactly 6 minutes, but nobody entered or left it. I called my manager, Sandra, even though she hated being called overnight. She told me to lock the office, save the video, and contact the sheriff if the men returned. I did not mention the phone call. I already sounded nervous enough. At 3:15, a state trooper came in for coffee. His name was Aaron Pike. I knew him from previous nights. I showed him the old $10 bill because the shorter man had left that one on the counter under the cigarette packs. Aaron looked it over. He said it was probably a reproduction, but he did not sound sure. He took it out to his cruiser and checked it with a light. When he came back, he said the paper contained the correct security fibers for the period. I asked how a 70-year-old bill could look brand new. He said collectors stored currency in special conditions. Then he asked where the men had gone. I showed him the sedan on the camera footage. He radioed another unit to check exit 41. The response came back a few minutes later. The exit was clear. The closed way station gate was locked and no vehicles were parked nearby. Aaron took down my statement. Leon gave one too. Before leaving, Aaron asked whether Mitch was still in the area. I gave him the cattle hauler's first name and company logo from memory. Aaron called dispatch. A red livestock truck matching that description had been reported stopped on the shoulder near exit 41 earlier that night. A road crew had seen it around midnight. Its hazard lights were on, but nobody was visible in or around the cab. 10 minutes later, the truck was gone. Mitch had fueled at our stop during that same time. Aaron looked at the receipt. Then he looked at the security footage. Mitch's truck appeared at pump 7 at 12:01, but the outside camera showed no driver getting out. Inside, the store camera showed me talking to Mitch at the register. He stood in front of me, drank coffee, and joked about cattle kicking the side of his trailer. His reflection did not appear in the glass cooler behind him. Aaron copied the footage onto a drive and told me not to delete anything. The rest of the shift passed quietly. At 7, Sandra arrived. I gave her the old $10 bill and explained everything again. She thought the men were scammers and the camera system had malfunctioned during the storm. She deposited the bill with the rest of the cash that morning. The bank called her before noon. They wanted to know where it had come from. Sandra told them a customer had used it overnight. The bank manager said the bill was genuine. The serial number, paper, ink, and printing marks were all correct for a 1950 issue. He also said that particular serial number had been recorded as destroyed in a Federal Reserve disposal batch in 1963. Sandra called me at home and asked whether I had kept the receipt from the cigarette sale. I checked my pockets. The receipt was folded inside my work shirt. The transaction time was 1:13 a.m. Under the item description for the 2 packs, there was an extra line of print. Exit 41, observation confirmed. I went back to work that night because Sandra could not find anyone to cover for me. The weather had cleared and the air felt cooler. Traffic was normal. Leon did not come in. Around midnight, I called the trucking company on his trailer. The dispatcher said Leon had arrived at a warehouse in Hayes that morning and completed his delivery. He had gone home afterward. That made me feel better. At 12:40, Mitch came through the door. He looked tired but normal. He bought coffee and asked whether the 2 government men had returned. I asked how he knew they had been there. They stopped me east of the exit. He described the same 2 men. They had parked their sedan across a county road and asked him what he saw above the way station. When he told them about the 3 white lights, the shorter man corrected him. He said there were 4, Mitch told me. I asked about the red light. Mitch looked confused. What red light? I reminded him that he had told me about a red light moving beside the fence. He shook his head. I never saw anything by the fence. I showed him the notes I had written during my shift. I had written red light, fence in the margin of a delivery log. Mitch stared at it for a while. Then he asked whether I had seen the fence myself. I said no. He leaned closer to the counter. There isn't a fence at that way station. I had driven past exit 41 many times. I remembered a chain link fence running along the back of the property. Mitch insisted there was only an open field. At 1 in the morning, we both drove out there. I followed his truck in my car. The sky was clear, and the moon was bright enough to see the fields. The closed way station was empty. There was no fence. There were post holes in a straight line behind the building, as if one had been removed recently, but the grass around them was tall and undisturbed. Near the last post hole, we found 2 cigarette butts placed side by side. They were the same unfiltered brand the men had bought. Mitch wanted to leave immediately. We drove back to the truck stop together. A black sedan followed us for 3 miles, then turned off onto a road with a dead-end sign. I finished my shift and drove home after sunrise. Nothing followed me. When I emptied my pockets, I found a crisp $20 bill folded behind my wallet. It was dated 1934. Across the face, someone had written 4 numbers in pencil. 113. Below that was one word. Accurate. I gave the talk on a Thursday night in the basement meeting room of the public library in Flagstaff, Arizona. The astronomy club met there twice a month. I had been a member on and off for about 6 years, though I was not an astronomer. I repaired commercial refrigeration systems for a living. I owned a decent telescope, knew the main constellations, and liked taking long exposure photographs when I had the time. The talk was about a set of pictures I had taken in 2007. I had avoided showing them for years because there was no good explanation for what they showed, and I knew how that sounded. The club president, Ellen Price, had seen one of the prints at my house and kept asking me to present them. She said the group would look at the images seriously and probably identify a lens effect, a satellite, or some kind of aircraft. By the time I agreed, almost 16 years had passed. The room had about 20 people in it that evening. Most were regulars. Ellen sat near the projector. My friend Marcus Bell was in the front row. A retired physics teacher named Paul Haskins had brought a notebook and a red pen, as he always did. The 2 strangers sat in the back. I noticed them before I started because they did not look like astronomy club people. Both wore black suits, white shirts, and dark ties. The taller one had a narrow face and very short gray hair. The other was younger looking, maybe in his late 30s, with dark hair combed flat against his scalp. Neither had a coat. It had been snowing since late afternoon, and everyone else had come in wearing boots, jackets, hats, or wet sweaters. The strangers' shoes looked dry. So did the shoulders of their suits. I assumed they were city employees using the library for another meeting. Ellen said visitors were welcome, so I did not ask who they were. I began with the basic details. In October 2007, I had driven north of town to photograph the Orionid meteor shower. I used an old Canon film camera because I could leave the shutter open longer without worrying about battery life. My location was a pull-out off Highway 180, past the last subdivisions but before the road climbed toward the higher forest. It had been a cold, clear night. No moon. Very little traffic. I had taken 12 exposures between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. I remembered seeing 3 meteors with my own eyes. I also remembered a bright object low in the northwest around midnight. I assumed it was an airplane coming toward me because it seemed to hold still for a long time. Then it moved straight upward. It did not rise at an angle like a plane. It moved vertically, stopped, and remained in the same spot for perhaps 10 seconds. After that, it split into 2 lights. That was how I described it during the talk, though split was not exactly right. One light stayed where it was, while another appeared slightly to the left. There was no visible movement between the 2 positions. One became 2, then both went out. I had my camera pointed in that general direction, but I did not know whether the event occurred during an open exposure. At the time, I was more annoyed than frightened. I thought I had missed something interesting. I finished the roll the next morning and took it to a photo lab in town. 9 frames showed stars and meteor trails. 2 were badly underexposed. 1 showed the object. I put that photograph on the projector screen. It showed the dark outline of the trees, a section of sky, and 2 pale oval lights above the ridge. The lights looked solid rather than blurred. Between them was a faint dark shape that blocked several stars. The room became quiet. Paul asked for the exposure time. I said 28 seconds. He asked whether the camera had moved. I said it had been mounted on a heavy tripod. Marcus asked if I had checked for aircraft. I said I had called the airport the next day. They had no unusual traffic in that area at the time I gave them. That did not prove much because I did not know the exact minute. The taller stranger in the back watched the screen. He had not looked away once since I started. The younger man watched me instead. I continued. There were other things I had not connected to the photograph until later. Around 11:30 that night, I heard a low mechanical sound in the trees behind the pullout. It was steady and soft, like an electric motor running somewhere underground. It lasted maybe a minute. A few minutes later, my car radio turned on by itself. The keys were in my coat pocket. The engine was off. The radio played a weather report from an AM station I had never listened to. The announcer gave the temperature as 42 degrees, which was wrong. It had been below freezing. Then the announcer said, "Visibility is limited above the northern boundary." I remembered those exact words because they did not fit the weather report. The broadcast cut off before I could check the station. When I opened the car door, the radio display was blank. During the talk, Paul asked whether the car might have had an electrical fault. I said it was possible. The car was an old Honda, and I had replaced the alternator a few months later. The younger stranger smiled slightly when I said that. It was the first expression I had seen from either of them. I showed another photograph, one that did not contain the lights. It had been taken about 20 minutes earlier and showed a meteor crossing above the trees. At the far left edge of that frame, there was a man. Only part of him was visible. A dark suit, one arm, and the side of a pale face. He appeared to be standing about 15 feet from the camera. I had not noticed him when I first got the film developed. A friend saw him years later when I scanned the negatives. I told the group I had been alone at the pullout. That caused more discussion than the lights. Ellen asked whether another photographer could have walked into the frame. I said I had not seen another car or person during the entire session. Marcus pointed out that the man's outline was sharp. If he had walked into a 28-second exposure, he should have been blurred unless he stood very still. Paul asked whether it could be a double exposure. I said the camera did not automatically advance, so it was possible in theory, but there was no second scene overlaid on the image. Someone near the back asked if I still had the negatives. The voice belonged to the taller stranger. It was the first time either man had spoken. I said yes. He asked where they were stored. The question felt too direct, and a few people turned around to look at him. I said they were safe. The stranger nodded. The younger man kept watching me. I went on with the rest of the story. After the lights disappeared, I packed my equipment. I remembered checking my watch and seeing 12:17. The next clear memory I had was standing beside my car with the driver's door open. My camera had been placed on the passenger seat. The tripod was folded and lying in the trunk. I did not remember packing either one. My watch showed 1:06. I had lost almost 50 minutes. At the time, I assumed I had become distracted or tired. Long exposure photography involved a lot of standing around in the dark. I could have packed up on autopilot and forgotten, but there were several problems. The camera still contained an unfinished roll. I would not normally have removed it from the tripod before completing the exposures. My gloves were wet. There was no snow or standing water near the pullout, and I had not walked far from the car. There was also a narrow cut across the back of my right hand. It looked fresh, but I did not feel it until I got home. Ellen asked whether I went to a doctor. I said no. It was a shallow cut and healed normally. The taller stranger leaned toward the younger one and whispered something. I could not hear the words. I showed a close-up of the original image with the two lights. When the lab scanned the negative at high resolution, a line of small dark marks became visible below the object. There were 7 marks. They formed a shallow curve. Paul suggested dust or damage on the negative. I agreed that was likely. The marks appeared only in that frame. Then Marcus stood and moved closer to the screen. He asked me to zoom in on the dark shape between the lights. I did. The shape covered a patch of stars, but one star appeared to shine through the center. That had always bothered me. If the shape was solid, the star should have been blocked. If the shape was transparent, it should not have hidden the other stars around it. The taller stranger spoke again. The central point was not a star. His voice was calm and quiet, but everyone heard him. I looked at him. I asked what it was. He said, "A reflection." Paul turned in his chair. "A reflection from what?" The stranger did not answer. The younger man looked down at his hands. I asked whether they had seen the image before. The taller man said no. I asked how he knew the point was a reflection. He gave me a small, polite smile. "It is brighter than the surrounding field," he said. That explanation did not make sense. Stars had different brightness levels. Paul started to say something, but Ellen stepped in and moved the talk forward. I finished with the steps I had taken to identify the object. I had contacted an aviation group, a university astronomy department, and 2 photographers. One person suggested a helicopter. Another suggested a lens reflection. The photographers could not explain why the dark shape blocked some stars but not others. I had never published the image or sent the original negative anywhere. That last statement seemed to interest the strangers. The younger one looked up sharply. The room was warm, but I noticed his breath for a second. A faint white cloud appeared in front of his mouth and vanished. No one else seemed to notice. Questions continued for about 20 minutes. Most were normal. Exposure settings, direction, weather, nearby military flights, whether I had consumed alcohol. I answered everything. The strangers did not write anything down. They did not take photographs of the slides or speak to anyone around them. They sat with their hands resting flat on their knees. At the end, Ellen thanked me and announced the next meeting. People began stacking chairs and putting on coats. The strangers remained seated. I disconnected my laptop and packed the prints into a hard plastic case. Marcus came over and said the talk had gone well. He asked whether I wanted to get coffee with him and Paul. Before I could answer, the lights in the room dimmed. They did not go out. They became dull for about 3 seconds, and the projector fans slowed. A low humming sound came from somewhere behind the walls. It was the same sound I remembered from the pullout in 2007. I stopped packing. The sound ended. The lights returned to normal. When I looked toward the back row, the 2 strangers were standing. The taller man walked directly to me. Up close, he looked older than I had first thought. The skin around his eyes had fine lines, but the rest of his face was smooth and pale. His tie was tied unusually high and tight. He looked at the plastic case. "You retained the first print," he said. I asked what he meant. "The print produced before the corrected set." I had never mentioned a corrected set. When I picked up the photographs from the lab in 2007, the employee had given me 2 envelopes. One contained the normal prints. The other contained a single darker version of the frame with the lights. She said the machine had produced it during calibration. That darker print showed something the others did not. Below the lights, near the tree line, there were 3 standing figures. I had kept it separate all these years. I asked the man how he knew about it. The younger stranger joined us. He had very dark eyes. Not black, but dark enough that I could not clearly see the pupils under the basement lights. "The first print was more accurate," he said. Marcus was still beside me. He asked the men who they were. The taller one reached into his suit and briefly showed a black wallet. There was a photograph, a silver seal, and some small lettering. He closed it before I could focus on any details. "Atmospheric records," he said. Marcus said that was not an agency. The taller man ignored him. He asked whether I had brought the darker print. I said no. He looked at the case again, then at me. "You should keep it stored separately from the negative," he said. I asked why, because they do not show the same event. The younger man moved closer. He smelled faintly of cigarettes, though nobody had been smoking. He said, "Your stated time was 12:17. I said, "Yes. The exposure began at 12:41. I felt confused for a second. I told him that was impossible. The object appeared before the missing period. He said, "Your sequence is incomplete." Marcus asked what sequence he meant. The man looked at him as if he had not noticed him until then. Then he turned back to me. "Do you remember entering the trees?" he asked. I said I had never entered the trees. "Do you remember the vehicle near the road?" There was no other vehicle. "Do you remember being asked to look upward?" I told him no. The taller man watched my face carefully. I felt embarrassed and angry. Several club members were still in the room, though most were pretending not to listen. I asked whether they were trying to make a joke out of my talk. The younger man said, "No." Then he smiled. His smile arrived slowly and stayed too long. The taller man touched his arm, and the smile disappeared. They walked toward the exit. As the younger man passed me, he stopped. He leaned close enough that only I could hear him clearly. "Thank you for remembering less than most people," he said. Then he followed the taller man upstairs. Marcus asked what he had said. I told him. He went after them. I followed a few seconds later, carrying the plastic case. The library lobby was empty. Snow blew against the glass front doors. The librarian at the desk said no one had passed her in the last several minutes. Marcus pushed through the doors and looked outside. There were no people on the sidewalk. A black sedan was parked across the street with its lights off. It pulled away as soon as we stepped outside. Marcus tried to take a picture with his phone. The screen froze and restarted. We went back downstairs. Ellen checked the attendance sheet. Visitors were supposed to sign in at the door. 2 unfamiliar names appeared at the bottom: Thomas Vale and Richard Crane. The handwriting was identical. Neither had provided an email address. I drove home around 10. Marcus followed me in his truck until I reached my neighborhood. The snow had become heavier and the roads were nearly empty. Nothing followed us. My wife, Dana, was asleep when I arrived. I locked the doors and took the photograph case into my office. The negatives were in a small, fireproof box in the closet. The darker print was stored in a separate envelope inside a desk drawer. Both were where I had left them. I took out the darker print. The 3 figures near the tree line were visible. 2 wore dark suits. The third figure stood between them. I had always assumed it was another man because the image was small. Under a desk lamp, I used a magnifying glass. The third figure wore my old brown canvas jacket. His right hand was raised toward the sky. On the back of that hand was a narrow, dark cut. Dana called from the bedroom and asked whether I had just opened the front door. I said no. We checked the house together. The doors were locked. The alarm had not gone off. Nothing looked disturbed. In the morning, there were footprints in the snow outside my office window. 2 sets came from the sidewalk and stopped below the glass. There were no tracks leading away. On the outside windowsill sat an unfiltered cigarette, burned down almost to the paper. Beside it was a small strip of photographic negative. I took it inside and held it up to the light. It showed the pullout beside Highway 180. My car was parked near the road. I stood at the edge of the trees with the two suited men. Above us, the sky was empty. I found the notebook in a metal cabinet behind a stack of old tires. My uncle Raymond had died in February, and by early April, I was still sorting through his house outside Toledo, Ohio. He had lived alone for more than 30 years and kept almost everything. The garage was the worst part. There were coffee cans full of screws, broken radios, car parts wrapped in newspaper, and boxes labeled with dates, but no description. That Saturday was cold and wet. Rain tapped against the garage door, and water had started coming in under one corner. I was trying to clear enough floor space to move Raymond's Buick when I found a small blue notebook wedged behind the cabinet. It was the kind people used for school notes, with a faded cloth cover and a black elastic band around it. The edges had gone soft from age. Raymond's name was written inside the front cover, along with the date June 18, 1968. Under that, he had written, "Light over Maumee River." I sat on an overturned bucket and started reading. Raymond had been 26 in 1968. He worked nights at a glass plant and lived with my grandparents in a house near Rossford. According to the notebook, he had been driving home shortly after 2 in the morning when he saw a bright light above the river. At first, he thought it was a plane coming toward him. The light stayed in the same place while he drove almost a mile. Then it moved sideways without changing height. He described it as white in the center with a faint red ring around it. He pulled onto the shoulder near an old boat launch and got out. The light dropped lower. Raymond wrote that the air became very still. He could no longer hear traffic from the highway or machinery from the factories. His car radio continued playing, but the singer's voice slowed until it sounded deep and stretched out. The light moved over the trees on the opposite bank. For a few seconds, he saw a dark shape around it. He drew it several times in the notebook. The drawings looked like a flattened oval with a notch on one side. He had written that it was difficult to judge the size because there was nothing near it for comparison. Then the light went out. Raymond got back into the car and checked the dashboard clock. It was 3:11. He believed he had stopped for less than 10 minutes. Almost an hour had passed. That part caught my attention because Raymond had never told me anything about missing time or strange lights. He was quiet and practical. He repaired lawnmowers for neighbors, watched baseball, and complained about property taxes. He was not someone I associated with stories like that. The next entries were stranger. 2 days after the sighting, 2 men came to my grandparents' house. They wore dark suits and said they worked for the government. Raymond did not write the name of an agency. He only wrote that their identification cards had no color except black and gray. They asked him where he had stopped, which direction the light moved, and whether he had seen anyone near the river. One of the men asked whether the object had made a clicking sound. Raymond had not reported a clicking sound to anyone. He had only told his father and a co-worker named Dennis Keene. According to the notebook, Raymond said he heard no clicking. The men asked the question 3 more times. Before leaving, one of them told him not to return to the boat launch after dark. Raymond did return. He went back the following week with Dennis. They found 3 areas of flattened grass near the water. Each was about 6 feet long and narrow at both ends. There were no tire tracks nearby. Dennis brought a camera, but every photograph taken near the flattened areas came out completely black. Pictures taken farther up the road developed normally. Raymond wrote that the men returned the next morning. This time they knew Dennis had been with him. One of them asked where the camera film had been processed. Raymond refused to say. The entries continued for several months. The 2 men came to the house 4 more times. Sometimes they arrived in a black car. Once they came on foot during a heavy rain, even though the nearest bus stop was more than 2 miles away. They always wore the same dark suits. Raymond began calling them the tall one and the older one. The tall one had pale eyes and rarely blinked. The older one had gray hair and spoke in a slow, careful way. Neither used contractions. Raymond wrote that they sounded like people reading sentences from a book. Their questions changed. Had he dreamed about the river? Had he heard his name spoken when nobody was nearby? Had birds gathered around the house? Had any clock stopped at 3:11? Raymond wrote yes to the last question. The kitchen clock stopped at 3:11 three nights in a row. My grandfather replaced the batteries. The clock still stopped. On the fourth night, they removed it from the wall and put it in the garage. At 3:11, every light in the house dimmed. After that, the visits became less frequent. The last entry from 1968 was dated December 2nd. Raymond wrote that the older man came alone. He asked whether Raymond had kept a record of their conversations. Raymond lied and said no. The man looked toward Raymond's bedroom and said, "Written records become inaccurate." Then he left. I turned through the remaining pages. The notebook did not end in 1968. There were entries from 1973, 1981, 1994, 2002, and 2011. Each described the men returning. Sometimes years passed between visits. The men looked almost unchanged. In 1981, Raymond wrote that the tall one appeared no older than he had 13 years earlier. The older one had slightly whiter hair but wore the same style of suit. In 1994, they asked Raymond whether he had told his brother's children about the river. That meant me and my younger brother, Caleb. Raymond had written our names in the margin. He had underlined mine twice. I closed the notebook. Rain beat harder against the garage roof. The light above the workbench flickered once, then stayed on. I told myself the notebook might have been fiction. Raymond could have written stories privately and never shown anyone. He had owned shelves of mystery novels and old science magazines. But the entries did not read like stories. Most were short and plain. Dates, times, weather, exact questions. There were grocery totals and repair notes written between the stranger pages. One entry about the men was followed by a reminder to replace the water heater valve. I put the notebook in my tote bag and continued cleaning. About an hour later, I heard a car door close outside. I looked through the garage window. A black sedan was parked across the road. It was an older model, long and square. The windows were dark. I could not see anyone inside. The car remained there for 5 minutes, then drove away. I assumed someone had stopped to check directions. That night, I took the notebook home to my apartment in Perrysburg. I read it again after dinner. Several details matched things I remembered from childhood. Raymond's kitchen clock had always been kept in a drawer. When I once asked why, he said it ran slow. He had covered the small window in his garage with plywood. I remembered him getting angry when Caleb tried to remove it. There had also been a section of the Maumee River he refused to drive past at night. He always took a longer route home from family gatherings, but he never explained why. Near the back of the notebook, I found a folded map. A circle had been drawn around the old boat launch. 6 other places were marked along the river, stretching from Waterville to Lake Erie. Dates were written beside each mark. The most recent date was October 14th, 2019. Raymond had written one sentence beneath it. 2 lights this time. They were waiting before I arrived. I slept badly. At 3:11 in the morning, I woke to a soft tapping sound. It came from the bedroom window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. I stayed in bed and listened. There were 3 taps, then a pause. A few seconds later, 3 more. I turned on the lamp. The tapping stopped. In the morning, I checked the outside of the window from the parking lot. I saw nothing unusual. I went back to Raymond's house on Sunday. My cousin Beth met me there to help with the kitchen. I did not mention the notebook. I wanted time to decide whether it was real or something Raymond had invented. Around noon, Beth asked whether I had moved the Buick. I said no. She said the driver's door was open. We went into the garage. The door was closed when we got there, but the interior light was on. The Buick's battery had been dead for months, so the light should not have worked. I opened the door. On the passenger seat sat an unfiltered cigarette. Neither Raymond nor anyone in our family smoked. Beth said it probably belonged to one of the hospice workers. I put it in an empty jar and screwed on the lid. Before leaving, I checked the metal cabinet where I had found the notebook. There was a clean rectangular space in the dust behind it, as if something larger than the notebook had been removed recently. That evening, I called my father. I asked whether Raymond had ever claimed to see something near the river in 1968. My father went quiet. Then he asked where I had heard that. I said I found some notes. He told me to throw them away. That response bothered me more than anything I had read. I asked why. He said Raymond had become obsessed after seeing a strange light. He believed men were watching him. My grandparents took him to a doctor, but Raymond refused medication and stopped talking about the incident. I asked whether men had actually visited the house. My father said he remembered two men coming once. He had been 14. They sat in the living room and asked Raymond questions. My grandfather made my father go upstairs, but he listened from the hallway. The men asked about a sound from the river. My father remembered one of them saying, "The sound was not intended for you." After the men left, my grandfather burned something in the backyard. My father did not know what it was. I asked whether the visitors came back later. He said he never saw them again. Then he repeated that I should destroy the notes. I did not. On Monday morning, I took the notebook to work. I worked in the billing office of a medical supply company. I kept it locked in the bottom drawer of my desk because I did not want it sitting unattended in my apartment. At lunch, I searched old newspaper archives. There had been reports of strange lights over the Maumee River in June 1968. A short article mentioned calls from residents in Rossford and Maumee. Police suggested aircraft or reflections from industrial equipment. One article quoted a night watchman who reported seeing a dark object above the trees. His name was Dennis Keene. I printed the article. When I returned to my desk, the bottom drawer was open. The notebook was still there. The elastic band had been removed and placed beside it. I asked the woman at the next desk whether anyone had been near my area. She said two men had walked through looking for the conference room. She described them as wearing dark suits. I checked with reception. No visitors had signed in. I took the notebook home in my purse. That night, a dark sedan followed me from the office parking lot. It stayed 2 cars behind through downtown Perrysburg. When I turned into a grocery store lot, it continued past. I waited 10 minutes before driving home. Nothing followed me after that. On Tuesday afternoon, 2 men came to Raymond's house while I was cleaning the upstairs bedroom. I saw their car through the front window. It was the same older black sedan I had seen across the road Saturday. Both men wore black suits, white shirts, and narrow ties. One was tall and thin with light gray eyes. The other looked older, with neatly combed silver hair and a flat, pale face. For a few seconds, I could not move. They looked almost exactly like Raymond's descriptions. The doorbell rang once. Then they knocked 3 times. I considered calling the police, but they were standing calmly on the porch in broad daylight. I put my phone in my pocket and opened the door without removing the chain. The taller man asked if I was Natalie Mercer. I said yes. He said they were reviewing items from Raymond Mercer's estate. I asked who they worked for. The older man opened a black wallet. He showed me a card for less than a second. I saw a photograph and a circular seal, but no agency name. Records Administration, he said. I told them an attorney was handling the estate. The taller man looked past me into the hallway. Did you find any journals? He asked. I said no. He watched my face. The older man said, a notebook with a blue cover may have been stored in the garage. I had not mentioned the notebook to anyone except my father. Even then, I had called it notes. I had never said it was blue. I asked how they knew about it. The older man said, Mr. Mercer was asked not to preserve inaccurate details. I tightened my grip on the door. I told them to leave the property. The taller man asked whether I had read the section dated June 24th, 1968. I remembered that date. It described the second visit from the men. I said I did not know what he meant. He looked toward the stairs. You moved it from the garage on Saturday at 14:28, he said. The exact time was possible. I had not checked a clock when I found it, but it would have been around then. The older man asked, did you remove the map? I had left the map folded inside the notebook. I said there was no map. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something. Then the tall man asked whether Raymond had written about the clicking sound. I remembered that question from the first visit in 1968. I said, he wrote that there wasn't one. Both men became still. The older man looked at the tall man. He remembered that? He asked. The tall man did not answer. I asked what the sound was. The older man looked back at me. Your uncle's account changed over time. I said the notebook showed he had written about it immediately. He stepped closer to the door. The porch light came on above them, even though it was daytime and the switch inside was off. "Written records create continuity," he said. "Continuity creates error." I told them I was calling the police. The taller man said, "That will not be necessary." I pulled out my phone. The screen showed 11. The time had been 2:47 when they arrived. I had no memory of almost 25 minutes passing. The two men were no longer on the porch. Their sedan was turning at the end of the street. I locked the door and called Beth. She came over with her husband, Nolan. I told them everything and showed them the notebook. Nolan checked the doorbell camera. The video showed the men arriving at 2:46. They stood on the porch for less than 2 minutes. The image froze at 2:48 and resumed at 3:11. When it returned, the porch was empty and I was standing in the doorway holding my phone. That evening, I made digital copies of every page. I gave one to Beth and mailed another flash drive to my brother in Columbus. Then I drove home with Nolan following behind me. I reached my apartment just before dark. The building hallway smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. A white envelope lay on the floor outside my door. Inside was a photograph of Raymond standing near the Maumee River. He looked young, maybe in his 20s. Two suited men stood behind him near the trees. Someone had written a date on the back. June 24th, 1968. Below the date was another line. Subject retained partial continuity. I checked the blue notebook. The entry for June 24th was gone. 2 pages had been removed cleanly from the binding. I stayed at Beth's house that night and made it home the next morning after sunrise. The black sedan was not outside. Nobody followed me. I put the notebook in a safe deposit box and kept the copies in 3 different places. A week later, my father called. He asked whether the men had found what they wanted. I said I did not know. He told me he had remembered something else from the night they visited in 1968. After my grandfather sent him upstairs, my father had heard Raymond arguing with the older man. Raymond kept saying he had written everything down. The older man replied, "Then she will find it." My father said he had always assumed the man meant my grandmother. I asked whether he remembered anything after that. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He called you Natalie." I had not been born for another 19 years. The request came in at 9:12 on a rainy Wednesday morning. I worked in the local history room at the public library in Ashland, Oregon. The room was on the 2nd floor, away from the main reading area, and most of the people who used it were researching property records, family names, or old businesses. We kept bound newspapers, city directories, maps, school yearbooks, and boxes of photographs that had never been fully cataloged. The man who called asked for newspapers from one specific week in 1974, June 17th through June 23rd. He did not give his name at first. He only asked whether we had the Ashland Daily Tidings on microfilm for those dates. I told him we did. He asked whether the film could be viewed privately. I explained that the microfilm readers were in the local history room and that other people might be present. There was a pause. Then he asked, were there reports of unusual lights that week? I said I did not know. What kind of lights? Lights observed after dark. That was all he said. I asked whether he was researching a specific event. He gave his name as Peter Van and said he was working on a family history project. The answer did not fit the question, but people often became secretive when researching relatives, especially if police reports or old scandals were involved. He said he would arrive before noon. I wrote his name and the dates on a request slip. Then I went downstairs to the microfilm cabinets and pulled the June 1974 reel so it would be ready. The weather outside had turned worse by then. Rain ran down the tall windows and low clouds covered the hills south of town. The lights in the history room flickered twice while I loaded the reel onto the machine. The first paper from June 17th contained nothing unusual. City council news, high school sports, grocery ads, and a story about a missing dog. June 18th had a short article on page 3. Several residents west of town had reported 3 bright lights above the foothills shortly after 11 at night. The sheriff's office said the lights were probably aircraft. A woman named Ruth Weller described them as white and steady, moving in a triangular pattern. I printed the article. On June 19th, there was a follow-up. A rancher on Wagner Creek Road reported that his cattle had gathered against the eastern fence during the same period. A power outage affected 4 properties for about 6 minutes. The utility company found no equipment failure. The article also mentioned 2 teenage boys who saw a dark shape above the trees. I printed that one too. The June 20th paper had no report, but a letter to the editor complained about low-flying military aircraft over the valley. The letter writer said there had been no engine sound. June 21st contained a small notice that the sheriff's office would not investigate further unless new witnesses came forward. The final paper from 23 had a photograph of a damaged orchard. Several rows of pear trees had lost leaves overnight in a narrow circular area. The owner blamed frost, though the temperature had stayed above 50. I printed everything that seemed connected and placed the pages in a folder. Peter Van never arrived. At 1 in the afternoon, I called the number he had given me. A recorded voice said the number was not in service. I checked the request slip to make sure I had copied it correctly. The name looked strange when I saw it again. The letters were printed in block capitals, though I remembered writing them in my normal handwriting. Peter Van. Under the name, someone had added another line. Ask about Hollis Farm. I had not written that. I showed the slip to my coworker, Melissa Grant. She said maybe I had added it while reading the articles and forgotten. I told her I had never heard of Hollis Farm. We searched the library catalog. There was no book or folder under that name. The city directories from the 1970s listed a Vernon Hollis on Wagner Creek Road. His occupation was orchard manager. The address disappeared from the directory after 1974. I checked an old county map. The Hollis property sat in the same area where the rancher had reported frightened cattle and the boys had seen the dark shape. That was when the history room phone rang. A woman asked whether I had found the June 21st article. I asked who was calling. She said, "He gave you the wrong date." Her voice was weak and distant, as though she were calling from a large empty room. I asked if she meant Peter Van. There was no answer. Then she said, "It was Thursday morning, not Wednesday night." The line clicked and went silent. I checked the newspapers again. June 20th, 1974 had been a Thursday. I searched the entire issue more carefully and found a small item near the back, below a department store advertisement. A county road worker named Leonard Shaw had reported finding a black sedan parked on Wagner Creek Road shortly before sunrise. 2 men in dark clothing stood beside the Hollis property fence. When Shaw stopped to ask if they needed help, they asked whether he had seen lights over the orchard. The article was only 5 paragraphs long. The men claimed to be federal investigators but did not identify an agency. They left before a deputy arrived. I made another print. The moment the page came out of the machine, the lights in the room dimmed. The microfilm reader shut off. For a few seconds, the only light came from the gray windows. A low, humming sound started inside the wall behind the newspaper cabinets. It was steady and faint, almost like a motor running on another floor. Melissa looked in from the hallway. She asked if I had heard it. Before I could answer, the sound stopped. The lights returned. The microfilm reader had advanced by itself. The screen now showed the front page from June 24th. I had not moved the controls. A black line ran down the middle of the image. Behind it, barely visible, was another article about the Hollis property. That page should not have existed. June 23rd was the Sunday edition, and the paper did not publish on Mondays in 1974. I checked the date at the top. Monday, June 24th, 1974. The headline read, "Federal Men Question Local Witnesses." I leaned closer to the screen. The article said 2 unidentified men had visited 6 homes west of Ashland. They asked residents whether they had seen lights, heard a low tone, or noticed birds leaving the area. One woman said the men already knew the exact time her kitchen clock had stopped. The article ended in the middle of a sentence. There was no continuation page. I tried to print it. The machine produced a blank sheet. I took a photograph of the screen with my phone. The picture showed only gray light and the edge of the reader. Melissa came into the room and looked at the article. She read the first paragraph out loud. Then the film jumped. The missing June 24 page disappeared, and the reel returned to June 23. We rewound and searched again. There was no June 24 issue. Melissa thought the date might have been a printing error on a special edition. I wanted that to be true, but the real labels had been checked and copied years earlier. There was no mention of an extra paper. At 3:30, two men entered the local history room. I had not heard them come up the stairs. They stood just inside the doorway. Both wore dark suits and plain black ties. The taller one had thin gray hair and a long face. The other was younger, maybe 40, with dark hair combed tightly back from his forehead. Neither wore a raincoat, even though it was still pouring outside. Their shoes were dry. The taller man asked if I was Anna Mercer. My name tag was clipped to my sweater, so that did not seem unusual. I said yes. He told me they were researching local newspaper reports from the 1970s. I asked if they were with Peter Van. The younger man looked at the taller one. Then he said, "Mr. Van did not arrive." It was not phrased as a question. I asked whether they knew him. The taller man ignored that and looked toward the microfilm reader. "Did anyone seem particularly interested in reports about unusual lights?" he asked. I said someone had called that morning. What did he request? I told him the dates. Did he ask about the orchard? No. That was technically true. The note about Hollis Farm had appeared on the slip, but the caller had not said it aloud. The younger man stepped toward the desk. His face looked very pale under the fluorescent lights. There was a faint line of moisture along his hairline, but the rest of him was dry. Did he ask about birds? He said. No. Stopped clocks? No. 3 lights above the western ridge? I said he only asked about unusual lights. The two men looked at each other. The taller one asked to see the material I had prepared. I told him they could use the microfilm reader like anyone else. We do not require the film, he said. Then what do you need? A confirmation of interest. His words sounded rehearsed. I asked which organization they represented. The younger man opened a black identification wallet. He held it up for less than a second. I saw a gray photograph, a round seal, and several lines of text too small to read. Federal Records Review, he said. I had never heard of it. I told them library records were private and that I would not give them information about another patron without a written request. The tall man looked at the request slip on my desk. You wrote the name Peter Van at 9:14, he said. The call had come at 9:12. I had written the slip while speaking to him. I asked how he knew the time. He said the request was anticipated. Melissa came back into the room carrying a cart of books. And us? She stopped when she saw the men. The younger one turned toward her. You observed the June 24 page, he said. Melissa put both hands on the cart. She asked who had told him that. No one answered. The humming sound started again. This time it came from the ceiling above us. The fluorescent tubes grew dim. The microfilm reader switched on by itself, though no film was loaded in the viewing area. A white square appeared on the screen. The younger man watched it. His expression changed slightly. He looked concerned, though his face barely moved. The taller man asked me whether I had printed the article about Leonard Shaw. I did not answer. He looked at the folder beside my computer. 4 copies were made, he said. I had printed 5 articles. 4 were in the folder. The 5th, the June 24 article, had come out blank. I asked why they cared about old newspaper reports. The younger man said, because some records continue. I asked what that meant. He looked toward the windows. Outside, the rain had stopped. The trees across the street were moving in the wind, but I could not hear them. I could not hear traffic either. The whole room had gone quiet except for the hum. The taller man asked where the original request slip had been stored. I pointed to the desk. He picked it up without asking. The line about Hollis Farm was gone. Only Peter Van's name and the dates remained. He turned the slip over. On the back was a blue ink stamp. Return 6/24/74. I had never seen that stamp before. The taller man handed the slip to the younger one. Incorrect retention, he said. Melissa asked them to leave. Neither man looked at her. The younger one asked me if the caller had sounded old. I thought about the voice. Peter Van had sounded middle-aged, maybe younger. I said no. Did he hesitate before giving his name? Yes. Did he ask whether the room was private? Yes. The younger man nodded. The tall one said, then he remembered the sequence. I asked who Peter Van was. The taller man looked at me. There was no Peter Van in 1974. I said I had not claimed there was. His eyes shifted toward the folder again. You found the name Leonard Shaw. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I had not mentioned that name. I asked if Leonard Shaw was Peter Van. The younger man answered before the taller one could stop him. Not then. The hum cut off. Sound returned to the room all at once. A truck passed outside. Water dripped from the roof. Somewhere downstairs, a child laughed. The taller man gave the younger one a hard look. Then he faced me. No materials need to be checked out, he said. Neither of them had touched the catalog or asked to use the film. I told them I was calling security. The younger man said the article was not in the paper. Melissa reached for the phone. The two men turned and walked out. We followed them into the hallway. They went down the stairs at a steady pace, side by side. Neither held the railing. By the time we reached the first floor, they were gone. The security guard at the front desk said no one matching their description had passed him. A black sedan was parked across the street. Its windshield wipers were not moving. Rainwater covered the glass, but I could see two pale shapes sitting in the front seats. The sedan pulled away before I could take a picture. Melissa and I checked the security cameras. The men appeared at the entrance at 3:28. The outside camera showed them walking in from the direction of the parking lot, though no car had stopped there. The lobby camera showed them crossing toward the stairs. For 11 seconds, the picture became distorted. When it cleared, both men were already on the second floor. There was no footage of them leaving. The library director, Carol Mendez, called the police. An officer took statements but said no crime had occurred. He copied the camera footage and suggested we contact him if the men returned. Before closing, I checked the newspaper reel one more time. The June 18th article about the lights was still there. The June 19th story about the cattle and power outage was gone. In its place was a furniture advertisement. The June 20th letter about silent aircraft was gone too. The Leonard Shaw article remained, but his name had changed. It now said Peter Van. I printed the page and showed Melissa. She compared it to the copy I had made earlier. The wording was identical except for the name. At the bottom of the newer print, below the final paragraph, a sentence had been added. Mr. Van declined to discuss whether he remembered the visitors. I took both copies home in a sealed envelope. My husband, Daniel, was waiting up when I arrived. I told him what had happened and showed him the articles. He read them at the kitchen table. Then he asked why the first copy had my name written in the margin. I looked. In small blue handwriting beside Leonard Shaw's name were the words, Anna Mercer, Local History Room, 328. I had not seen them before. We locked the doors and left the porch light on. Nothing happened during the night. The next morning, I returned to work before opening. Melissa met me upstairs. The request slip was back on my desk. It had been placed neatly beside the keyboard. Peter Van's name was gone. The slip now listed only the dates, June 17 through June 23, 1974. Under the dates, someone had written, "No further interest reported." I checked the microfilm cabinet. The June 1974 reel was missing. In its place was a sealed metal canister with no library label. A strip of white tape crossed the lid. Written on it in blue ink were 3 words, "Do not remember more." The markings showed up on the north side of the bridge, sometime between midnight and 4 in the morning. I worked for the county road department in western Maryland, mostly patching pavement, clearing drains, replacing signs, and doing whatever else came up. That week, I was on an early maintenance shift because crews were preparing for heavy rain. I reached the old Mill Creek Bridge at 4:35 on a Tuesday morning after a driver reported something painted across the concrete rail. The bridge carried Route 144 over a narrow creek outside Hancock. It was short, maybe 60 feet long, with woods on both sides and no houses close enough to see it clearly. The road curved just before the east end, so people came onto it suddenly. I parked the county truck with the amber lights running and walked over with a flashlight. The markings covered most of the north railing. They were black, but they did not look spray painted. The surface was too even. There were 7 shapes, each about 2 feet tall, arranged in a straight line. Some looked like circles cut by vertical strokes. Others were narrow triangles with curved lines underneath. The last one resembled a ladder with one side missing. I had seen plenty of graffiti, names, tags, crude pictures, threats, political stuff. This was different. The shapes were neat and measured. Every line had the same width. There were no drips. I touched one with my glove. The black material felt dry and smooth. It was colder than the surrounding concrete. I checked the road and the gravel shoulder for paint cans or footprints. There was nothing. The ground was damp from a light shower earlier, so anyone standing near the rail should have left marks in the mud. I called my supervisor, Curtis Lane. He told me to photograph it, then paint over it. We had received complaints before about symbols on bridges frightening drivers, and the county did not want people stopping to take pictures. I took out my work phone. The camera would not focus. It kept sharpening the trees behind the railing while the markings blurred into a dark strip. I tried from several angles. Same result. I stepped back and photographed the whole bridge. That picture came out normally, but the symbols did not appear. The concrete rail looked blank. I checked the actual railing again. The markings were still there. I assumed the black paint was reflecting the work lights in a way the camera did not handle well. It was still dark, and the mist from the creek made everything look slightly washed out. I sent Curtis the wide picture and told him the symbols were not showing. He replied that he did not care what they looked like. He just wanted them covered before morning traffic picked up. The county kept gray masonry paint in the truck for bridge damage. I stirred a can, poured some into a tray, and started rolling it over the first symbol. The paint did not stick. It pulled away from the black surface and gathered in small beads, like water on wax. I tried a brush. Same thing. I used a scraper to rough up the surface. The blade made a faint metallic sound even though the railing was concrete. I pressed harder. A thin piece of black material peeled loose. Underneath it, the concrete looked new. Not clean. New. The rest of the bridge rail was rough and stained from decades of rain and road salt. The patch below the marking was pale gray and perfectly smooth. The black piece in my glove felt heavier than it should have. It bent slightly, like thick plastic, but when I folded it, it broke into powder. The powder spread over my glove and disappeared between the fibers. That was the first moment I considered leaving it alone. Then a tractor-trailer crossed the bridge behind me, shaking the rail. The driver slowed and stared through the windshield at the symbols. I knew more traffic would arrive soon. I went back to the truck and got a wire wheel attachment for the cordless grinder. It took the black material off, though the tool made a high whining sound and the battery drained much faster than normal. I had started with a full charge. It died after 2 symbols. The spare battery lasted through 3 more. By the time I reached the final marking, the sky had begun turning gray behind the trees. A low knocking sound came from under the bridge. I stopped the grinder. 3 knocks. They sounded like someone hitting the underside of the concrete deck with a hammer. I walked to the rail and looked down. The creek was high and brown from recent rain. Broken branches had collected against the center pier. I could not see anyone below. The sound came again. 3 knocks, then a pause. I checked my watch. 20 seconds passed. 3 more knocks. I called out to ask if anyone was under there. The woods stayed quiet. I walked to the end of the bridge and shined my light down the bank. There was a narrow maintenance path leading under the deck, but it was covered with wet leaves and mud. No footprints. I waited through 2 more sets of knocks. Then they stopped. When I returned to the railing, the last symbol looked different. I was sure it had been shaped like an open ladder. Now the lower line curved inward, making it look almost like an eye. I stared at it for a while, trying to remember the original shape. I had no clear photograph to check. I ground it off. Once all 7 were removed, the gray paint finally held. I covered the clean patches and feathered the edges so they matched the old concrete as well as possible. While I worked, I noticed small dark marks on the opposite railing. They were not full symbols, just short vertical lines, each about an inch long, evenly spaced along the south side. I counted 7. I did not paint those. They looked like stains or old repair marks, and I was already behind schedule. I finished at 6:10, cleaned the tools, and drove to the maintenance yard. Curtis was drinking coffee in the break room. He asked whether I had removed the graffiti. I said yes. He asked if it was gang-related. I told him I did not think so and explained that the camera would not capture it properly. He laughed and said my phone lens was dirty. I showed him the picture of the blank railing. He zoomed in. There was a dark shape near the center of the bridge. At first we thought it was part of the trees. Then Curtis adjusted the brightness. A man stood on the far side of the railing. He wore a black suit and a white shirt. He faced me while I took the picture. I had not seen him. The photo had been taken before I started painting, when the road was empty. Curtis said it was probably a driver who had stopped behind the truck. I reminded him there was no vehicle in the image. He looked again, then handed the phone back. "Send it to me," he said. I tried. The image disappeared. It was not in the gallery, deleted folder, message attachments, or cloud backup. The other bridge photographs remained, including the ones where the symbols appeared blurred. Curtis became less interested after that. He told me to fill out a vandalism report and move on to clearing culverts. The rest of the day was normal until I cleaned my gloves. The right glove had 7 black lines across the palm. They were under the fabric coating, not on the surface. I tried washing them with soap and degreaser. They remained. I threw the gloves away. That night, heavy rain moved into the area. Wind pushed branches against the side of my house, and water filled the drainage ditch along the road. At 2:16 in the morning, I woke to 3 knocks. They came from the living room wall. I sat up and listened. After 20 seconds, the knocks repeated. My wife, Megan, woke and asked what the noise was. I told her it was probably a loose gutter or branch. I checked the outside of the house with a flashlight. Rain came down hard enough to soak my shirt in seconds. Nothing touched the wall. The knocking did not repeat after I went outside. When I came back in, Megan asked why I had black paint on my hand. 7 narrow lines crossed my right palm. They looked exactly like the marks inside the glove. I washed them under hot water. They faded, but did not disappear. The next morning, I reported to the yard at 4:20. Curtis wanted us out early to check flood-prone roads. A dark sedan was parked across from the gate. It was an older full-size car, black with dull paint and narrow tires. Its headlights were off. 2 men stood beside it. Both wore dark suits under long black coats. One was tall and thin, with gray hair cut close to his head. The other was shorter, with dark hair combed flat and a broad, pale face. They watched me park. I assumed they were state inspectors or insurance people. Flood events brought out officials from different departments. The taller man walked toward me. He asked if I was Nathan Cole. My name was printed on the county jacket I was wearing, though the letters were small. I said yes. He told me they were checking a report concerning the Mill Creek Bridge. I asked which agency they worked for. The shorter man opened a black wallet. He held it up briefly. I saw a photograph and a circular seal, but I could not read the text. Structural Records Division, he said. I had never heard of it. The taller man asked whether I had removed the markings from the north railing. I said I had painted over them. Did you copy the symbols first? He asked. The question caught me off guard. I told him I tried to photograph them, but the pictures did not come out. That was not the question, he said. His voice was calm, almost polite. Did you copy them by hand? No. Did you trace them? No. Did you write down their order? No. The 2 men looked at each other. Then they both nodded. That was it. No disappointment, no follow-up question, no request to inspect the bridge. They simply seemed satisfied. I asked why they wanted to know. The shorter man looked at my right hand. I had kept it in my jacket pocket because the black lines were still faintly visible. You did not preserve the sequence, he said. No. Then the record ended. I asked what record he meant. Neither answered. The tall man turned toward the sedan. I stepped in front of him and told him they needed to speak with Curtis if they were conducting county business. He stopped. Up close, his skin looked gray around the eyes. There were drops of rain on his coat, but his hair was completely dry. We have completed the visit, he said. The shorter man added, you should not return before daylight. I said crews were already scheduled to inspect the bridge. Not before daylight, he repeated. Curtis came through the yard gate carrying a coffee thermos. I called his name. He looked directly at me, then toward the men. What? He asked. I told him the inspectors wanted to discuss the bridge. He stared past them. What inspectors? The two men were standing less than 10 feet from him. I pointed. Curtis looked at the empty road beside the sedan. His face showed no sign that he saw anyone. The shorter man watched him. He did not observe the first set, he said. I felt pressure build in my ears. The yard lights dimmed. The tall man said, "We should leave." They walked to the sedan, got inside, and drove east. Curtis watched the car pull away. He asked who had been driving it. I told him the two men I had just spoken to. He said he had seen only the car. I described them. Curtis told me to stop messing with him and get the flood barricades loaded. At 5:05, another crew radioed that water was rising near Mill Creek. Curtis sent me and a worker named Luis Harper to inspect the bridge. The rain had weakened, but it was still dark. As we approached, my truck radio filled with static. A low tone came through the speakers. It stayed steady even when I turned the volume down. Luis tapped the dashboard. The tone stopped. We reached the bridge at 5:27. The gray paint I had applied was gone. The north railing looked clean, as though I had never painted it. The 7 black symbols had returned. Luis saw them immediately. He got out and asked what they meant. I told him I did not know. He raised his phone. I grabbed his wrist before he took a picture. The reaction was automatic. I remembered the men asking whether I had copied the sequence and the way they nodded when I said no. Luis pulled away and asked what was wrong with me. I told him the markings were part of a possible investigation and we should not photograph them. That sounded weak even to me. He took the picture anyway. His phone flashed. All 7 symbols disappeared from the railing. Not faded. Disappeared. The concrete was bare and wet. Luis lowered the phone. The image on his screen showed the bridge, the railing, and 7 clear black markings. Behind them, near the trees, stood 2 men in dark suits. Luis turned toward the woods. Nobody was there. 3 knocks came from beneath the bridge. Luis froze. 20 seconds later, the sound repeated. I told him we needed to leave. He asked if someone was trapped below. We took flashlights and followed the maintenance path down the east bank. Mud slid under our boots, and the creek pushed hard against the pier. The knocking came from inside the concrete support. 3 impacts, evenly spaced. There were no access doors, hollow spaces, or utility chambers in that section. I knew because I had worked on the bridge several times. Luis placed his hand against the pier. He pulled it back quickly. He said the concrete felt warm. A narrow black line appeared where his palm had touched. I told him not to touch it again. The knocking stopped. For a few seconds, I heard a low humming sound under the rush of the water. Then a white light moved through the trees on the opposite bank. It stayed low, maybe 6 feet above the ground. It crossed from left to right without lighting the branches around it. Luis asked if it was a flashlight. I said no. The light stopped. 2 dark shapes stood behind it. They were tall and still. I could not see faces or details, but they looked like men. Luis raised his phone again. The screen went black. The light vanished. We climbed back to the road. The dark sedan was parked behind our county truck. Its doors were closed. Its windows reflected the bridge lights, and I could not see inside. I unlocked the truck remotely. The headlights flashed. The sedan's headlights flashed at the same time. We got into the county truck and locked the doors. The sedan backed away and turned west. It drove across the bridge slowly. As it passed the north railing, the 7 symbols appeared again, one after another, like wet paint rising through concrete. Luis watched them from the passenger seat. I asked if he had copied the photograph anywhere. He said his phone backed up automatically. I told him to check. The picture was gone. A new image had replaced it. It showed Luis and me standing beneath the bridge with our hands against the center pier. In the photograph, both of us faced the concrete. Neither of us remembered standing that way. Between us, someone had drawn 7 black symbols on the pier. We returned to the maintenance yard just after sunrise. Curtis looked at Luis's hand and sent him to urgent care. The black line had darkened, though the skin was not broken. I filled out another report and avoided drawing the markings. I described them only as 7 unknown symbols. When I reached the part about the 2 men, Curtis told me to leave it out unless I had names or badge numbers. I did. The county closed the bridge for inspection that afternoon because of high water. Engineers found no structural damage and no markings on either railing. The knocking was not reported again. I made it home before dark. The black lines on my palm faded over the next 3 days. Luis said his disappeared after a week. I drove past Mill Creek once after the bridge reopened. I did not stop. The concrete rail looked normal from the road. At home that evening, I found a folded piece of paper inside my work jacket. It was blank except for 7 faint gray smudges in a row. I threw it into the wood stove without looking at the shapes closely. As the paper burned, something knocked 3 times from inside the metal chimney. I checked the clock. 20 seconds later, there was only rain against the roof. I first saw the man across the clearing a little after 4 in the afternoon. I was hunting whitetail on public land near Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. It was the second week of rifle season, but I had taken a weekday off because the woods were usually quieter. The weather had been cold and wet all morning. A thin rain kept starting and stopping, and patches of old snow remained under the hemlocks. I had been sitting against a fallen tree for about an hour when I noticed him. He stood at the far end of the clearing, maybe 150 yards away, near a line of young pines. At that distance, I could only tell that he was tall and dressed in dark clothing. I assumed he was another hunter. That bothered me because he was not wearing orange. State law required hunters to wear fluorescent orange during rifle season, and most people on public land wore more than the minimum. This man had nothing bright on him at all. I raised my binoculars. He wore a black suit, white shirt, dark tie, no hat, no hunting vest or backpack. His shoes looked black too. He stood with his hands at his sides, facing directly toward me. I lowered the binoculars and checked behind myself, thinking he might be watching someone else. The woods were empty. When I looked again, he had not moved. I gave him a small wave. He did not respond. I considered calling out, but the clearing was wide and the wind was blowing toward him. I did not want to ruin the area if there were deer nearby. For the first few minutes, I tried to ignore him. I checked the tree line to my left and watched a group of chickadees moving through the brush. Every so often, I looked back. The man stayed in the same spot. After 10 minutes, I began to feel uneasy. It was around 35 degrees, and the rain had started again. Water ran from the edge of my cap. The man had no coat over his suit. He did not shift his weight or lift a hand to wipe his face. I raised the binoculars and focused more carefully. His suit looked old-fashioned. The jacket was long and the tie was narrow. His hair was dark and combed flat against his head. I could not make out his facial features clearly. The strange part was that the binoculars were good. I could see drops of water on the pine branches around him, but his face stayed pale and blurred, almost as if the lenses would not focus on it. I adjusted the center wheel. The trees sharpened. His face did not. He slowly raised his right hand. I thought he was finally waving. Instead, he pointed toward the ground beside me. I looked down. Nothing was there except wet leaves, my pack, and the rifle resting across my knees. When I looked back, his arm was at his side again. A low sound started somewhere in the woods. It was not an animal call. It was a steady tone, soft enough that I almost confused it with wind. It seemed to come from the ground behind the clearing. The birds stopped moving. One moment they were hopping through the branches, and the next, they were gone. I did not see them fly away. The rain continued, but I could no longer hear it hitting the leaves. I checked my phone. There was no service, which was normal in that area. The time showed 4:18. I decided to leave. I stood, unloaded the chamber of my rifle, and slipped the safety on. I kept the rifle with me because I did not know who the man was or what he wanted. When I rose, he stepped backward into the pines, not turned and walked. He moved backward while still facing me. Then he stopped. I could see only the front half of his body between the branches. I called out, "You all right over there?" He did not answer. My voice sounded flat in the clearing. There was no echo, no normal carry. The low tone became stronger. I started toward the trail that ran along my side of the clearing. My truck was about a mile south. The shortest way back would have taken me away from the man. I walked maybe 50 yards before I heard a single sharp click behind me. It sounded like the action of a rifle being worked. I turned immediately and brought my own rifle up, keeping the muzzle pointed low. The clearing was empty. The man was gone. I scanned the pines with the scope. I saw trunks, brush, and dark gaps between the trees. No person. I waited several minutes. Nothing moved. I thought about walking away and reporting him to a game warden. A man in a black suit standing in hunting country without orange was either lost, unstable, or trying to get hurt. Instead, I made a bad decision. I crossed the clearing to see where he had been standing. I kept my rifle pointed down and moved slowly. The grass was wet and flattened in places by deer. Mud covered the ground near the pines. As I got closer, I expected to see boot prints. I found shoe prints instead. They were narrow, with smooth soles and a small heel. Dress shoes. The prints were deep, as if the man had been standing there for a long time. Rainwater had collected inside them. There were no tracks leading to the spot. There were no tracks leaving it either. Just two polished shoe impressions side by side in the mud. I crouched and touched one. The water inside felt warm. That made me pull my hand back. The air temperature was close to freezing. Every puddle in the area was cold enough to hurt my fingers. The water in the print felt like it had been sitting indoors. The low tone stopped. Normal sound returned. Rain hit the branches. A truck moved somewhere on a distant road. I heard a crow calling uphill. Then a voice spoke behind me. It said my first name, Caleb. The voice was quiet and close. I turned so fast that I lost my footing and dropped to one knee. Nobody was there. I had the rifle against my shoulder without remembering raising it. My finger was outside the trigger guard, but only because years of habit put it there. I swung the barrel across the tree line. Nothing. I shouted that I was armed. No answer came. I backed into the clearing and kept moving until I had a clear view around me. That was when I noticed the time. My phone showed 5:07. It had been 4:18 when I started leaving. Crossing the clearing and checking the prints should have taken less than 15 minutes. Almost 50 minutes had passed. The light had changed too. The woods were darker, and the rain looked silver against the trees. I returned to the trail and walked quickly toward my truck. About halfway back, I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow and even, one step every 2 or 3 seconds. Whenever I stopped, they stopped. I did not look back at first. I told myself it was water dropping from branches or a deer following the same path. The steps continued for several hundred yards. I turned around. The trail behind me was empty. A black shape stood farther back between two trees. I could not tell whether it was the man or just a stump. When I raised my binoculars, the shape was gone. I kept walking. The forest became strangely unfamiliar. I had marked the trail on my GPS, but the screen kept rotating. The arrow pointed east, then west, then directly behind me. I knew I was on the right trail because I recognized a split boulder and an old logging cut. Still, it seemed longer than before. I reached the parking area just after 6. My truck was the only vehicle there. A narrow strip of white paper was tucked under the driver's windshield wiper. I thought it was a warning from a game warden or a note from another hunter. When I pulled it free, I found a blank piece of paper folded in half. Inside, someone had written one sentence in black ink. "You did not fire." I looked around the lot. There were no fresh tire tracks except mine. The rain had softened the gravel enough that another vehicle should have left marks. I got into the truck and locked the doors. Before starting the engine, I checked my rifle. There was a round in the chamber. I was certain I had unloaded it before leaving the fallen tree. I remembered pulling the bolt back and catching the cartridge in my hand. I had put it into the front pocket of my vest. I checked the pocket. The same cartridge was still there. I unloaded the rifle again and counted the rounds. There was one extra. I had brought 10 cartridges. I now had 11. One had a dark line around the brass casing. I separated it from the others and placed it in the center console. The truck started normally. I called my wife, Erin, as soon as I reached an area with service. I told her I was heading home and had run into someone strange in the woods. I did not tell her the whole story while I was driving. A dark sedan followed me for part of the way. I first noticed it near Marionville. It stayed 3 or 4 cars behind and matched every turn. The headlights looked dim and yellow, even though it was almost fully dark. And when I pulled into a gas station, the sedan continued past. I waited inside for 20 minutes. I reached home around 8:30. Erin was waiting in the kitchen. I told her about the man, the shoe prints, the missing time, and the note on the windshield. She asked to see the note. It was gone. I checked every pocket and the floor of the truck. I knew I had placed it in the cup holder. It was not there. The extra cartridge was gone too. The center console was closed and nothing else had been disturbed. Aaron thought I had become disoriented from cold and stress. That was possible. I had been alone for hours and hypothermia could affect judgment. But my clothes were dry under the rain gear, and I had not felt confused until after seeing the prints. I slept badly and woke several times thinking I heard someone walking across the gravel driveway. The next morning, I found two men standing near my truck. It was a little after 7. The sky was clear, but the temperature had dropped overnight and frost covered the yard. Both men wore black suits under dark overcoats. One was tall with gray hair and a narrow face. The other was shorter, maybe 45, with black hair combed straight back. Their shoes were polished. There was no car in the driveway. I opened the front door but stayed inside. The tall man asked whether I was Caleb Morris. I said yes. He told me they were investigating unsafe hunting activity on state land. I asked if they were game wardens. The shorter man opened a black identification wallet. He showed it too quickly for me to read. I saw a photograph and a round silver seal. Field Safety Office, he said. I had never heard of it. I told them they could contact me through the Pennsylvania Game Commission. The tall man asked, "Did you discharge your rifle during the encounter yesterday?" He said encounter, not hunting trip, not incident. I asked what encounter he meant. The individual across the clearing, he said. I felt pressure build behind my eyes. I had told only Aaron about the man. I asked how they knew. The shorter man looked toward the woods behind my house. "Did you fire your rifle?" he repeated. "No." "Not once?" "No." "Did you place your finger on the trigger?" I thought about the voice behind me and how quickly I'd raised the rifle. "No." The two men looked at each other. Their reaction was small, but they seemed relieved. The tall man asked if I had found anything on the ground. I said only footprints. "What type?" "Dress shoes." "Were the impressions filled with water?" I did not answer. The shorter man said, "Warm water?" Erin stepped into the hallway behind me. I could feel her listening. I asked the men for their names. The tall one said, "Mr. Keene." The shorter one said, "Mr. Lyle." Neither gave a first name. I asked where their car was. Keene looked toward the road. We walked. The nearest town was almost 4 miles away. There were no footprints in the frosted grass leading from the road to my driveway. I told them I was calling the police. Lyle asked, "Did the observer speak your name?" I stopped. I had not told Aaron that part. I had left it out because I knew how it sounded. I asked him to repeat the question. "Did he use your name?" "Yes." "Before or after you reached the prints?" "After." Lyle's expression changed. His mouth tightened and he looked toward Keene. Keene asked whether I had answered. "No." "Are you certain?" "Yes." He stepped closer to the porch. His shoes made a soft scraping sound on the concrete. "You must be exact," he said. "Did you respond when addressed?" I remembered shouting that I was armed. I had not used the man's name or said yes. I didn't answer him. Keene nodded. Lyle looked past me at Aaron. "Was anyone else present in the clearing?" "No." "Any dogs?" "No." "Birds?" "I heard birds earlier." After the observer departed, I said I did not know. The questions felt wrong for any kind of hunting investigation. I asked why it mattered whether I fired. Keene said, "A discharge would have complicated the account." "What account?" "The one you retained." I told them to leave. Neither moved. Lyle looked at my truck. "You transported an additional round of ammunition home." I felt my mouth go dry. I asked where it went. He said, "It was not yours." "Then whose was it?" He ignored the question. Keene asked if I had handled the cartridge with bare skin. I said no, though I could not remember whether I had worn gloves when I placed it in the console. He looked at my right hand. A thin, dark mark crossed the pad of my index finger. I had assumed it was dirt from cleaning the rifle. Keene said, "Wash that with cold water." I asked what it was. "Residue." "From what?" He looked toward Lyle. Lyle said, "A failed comparison." Neither explained further. A county sheriff's car turned onto our road. Aaron had called while they were questioning me. The men saw it at the same time. Keene reached into his coat and took out a white card. He placed it on the porch railing. "We may need to speak again if your memory improves," he said. I told him it would not. Lyle looked at me for several seconds. Then he said, It already has. They walked down the driveway toward the road. The sheriff's car passed behind a line of trees for maybe 3 seconds. When it became visible again, the men were gone. No vehicle had stopped. There was nowhere for them to hide except a shallow drainage ditch covered in frost. Deputy Mara Vickers searched the road and nearby woods. She found no one. The white card on the railing was blank. I gave her a full statement. She contacted the Game Commission, and they confirmed no officers had been sent to my home. Mara checked my truck camera. The footage showed the men standing beside the vehicle at 7:03. Both kept looking toward the windshield. At 7:08, the camera image broke into gray lines for 14 seconds. When it returned, the men were on the porch. There was no footage of them crossing the yard. That afternoon, I cleaned the rifle at my workbench. The bore was dirty. I had cleaned it before the hunting trip, and I had not fired a shot in the woods. Still, there was fresh powder residue around the chamber. I checked the target log I kept in the gun case. One new entry had been written below my last range visit. The date was from the previous day. The time was 4:37 p.m. Under rounds fired, someone had written 0. Under distance, it said 147 yards. That was almost exactly the distance across the clearing. Aaron wanted me to turn everything over to the sheriff, so I called Mara again. She came to the house and photographed the logbook. Before she left, she asked if I had checked my hunting jacket. I had not. In the front pocket, I found a polished black button. It was not from my clothing. A short piece of dark thread remained attached. Mara placed it in an evidence bag. I washed the mark on my finger with cold water. It faded, but did not disappear completely. I stayed home for the rest of the day. After dark, a black sedan parked across from the house for almost an hour. The windows were too dark to see inside. Mara sent a patrol car by, but the sedan left before it arrived. I did not hunt again that season. A week later, I drove back to the parking area during daylight with my brother-in-law, Nathan. We stayed together and carried no rifles. The trail looked normal. The clearing was empty. We crossed to the place where the man had stood. The mud had frozen. The 2 shoe prints remained clear. A third print had appeared between them. It faced the opposite direction, toward the trees. Nathan measured the distance to where I had been sitting, 147 yards. On the trunk of the nearest pine, at eye level, someone had pressed a brass rifle casing into the bark. It had not been fired. A dark line circled the casing. I left it where it was and made it home before sunset. The humming started on a Monday evening while I was cleaning a walleye near the water. I had rented a small cabin on the south shore of Lake Sakakawea in North Dakota for 2 weeks. It was late September, after most summer visitors had gone home. I had been working too much that year and wanted somewhere quiet where I could fish, read, and keep my phone turned off. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt access road about 40 minutes from the nearest town. There were 3 other cabins along that part of the shore, but only one was occupied. A retired couple named Glenn and Marcy Holt stayed about half a mile east of me. The other places had been closed for the season. That first evening was cold and clear. The wind had dropped after sunset, and the lake looked flat except for small waves touching the rocks. I was standing at an outdoor table beside the cabin when I heard the sound. It was low and steady, almost below hearing. At first, I thought a boat engine was running somewhere out on the water. Sound carried a long way across the lake, especially when the air was still. I stopped cutting the fish and listened. The humming came from the west, where the shoreline curved into an undeveloped stretch of state land. There were no docks or buildings in that direction, only low bluffs, grass, and scattered cottonwoods. The sound lasted about 30 seconds, then it stopped. I finished cleaning the fish and went inside. Around 8, it started again. This time I could hear it through the cabin wall. The window glass vibrated lightly. A spoon in the sink made a faint tapping noise against a plate. I stepped outside with a flashlight. The humming continued until I walked down the path toward the water. When I reached the bottom step, it stopped. The silence came so quickly that my ears felt blocked. I stood there for a minute, looking over the lake. Nothing moved, no boat lights, no vehicles along the shore. The sky was clear enough to see stars reflected between the rocks. I went back inside. The humming did not return that night. The next evening, it started at almost the same time. I had written 7:36 in the margin of a fishing magazine after the first night. On Tuesday, the clock above the stove showed 7:34 when the sound began. I walked outside again. It seemed louder near the west side of the cabin. I followed it down to the shore, and it stopped when I came within 10 or 15 feet of the water. I backed away. After about 20 seconds, the humming returned. I moved closer. It stopped again. I did that 3 times. Each time, the sound ended at nearly the same spot on the path. I thought there might be some buried electrical cable or pump nearby. The cabin had an old well system, and the septic tank sat uphill. I checked the breaker panel, shut off the main power, and waited in the dark. The humming returned with the electricity off. It did not sound mechanical in the normal way. There was no uneven vibration, no change in speed, no high or low cycle. It was one smooth tone. I called the property owner, a man named Curtis Knoll. He said there were no underground utilities near the shoreline. Power came from poles along the access road. The well pump sat behind the cabin, nowhere near the water. Curtis asked whether it could be a grain dryer from across the lake. I told him it stopped whenever I approached the shore. He laughed and said sound did strange things over water. That explanation seemed reasonable enough. On Wednesday, rain moved in from the northwest. The lake became rough and the temperature dropped into the 40s. I stayed inside most of the day. At 7:35, the humming started. I turned off the television and recorded it on my phone. The phone picked up nothing. When I played the file back, I heard rain on the roof, the refrigerator, and my own breathing. The low tone was absent. I tried again while the sound was still happening. Same result. Then I noticed the clock. The second hand had stopped. The clock was battery powered. I took it down, changed the battery, and put it back. It ran normally until the humming began again at 8:12. The second hand stopped at once. I stepped outside. The sound came from the west shore, but the wind pushed hard from that direction. It should have scattered or covered anything faint. Instead, the humming stayed clear. I walked toward the lake. Halfway down the path, my flashlight dimmed. At the same moment, I saw a pale light near the waterline about 200 yards west. It was not a flashlight beam. It looked like a small white lamp hanging a few feet above the ground. The humming stopped. The light remained. I watched it for several seconds. It moved slowly along the shore, staying at the same height. Rain passed through the space around it, but the light did not reflect on the wet ground. Then it went out. I returned to the cabin and locked the door. The next morning, I walked west along the shore. The rain had stopped, but low clouds covered the lake. Mud filled the narrow animal trails between the grass and rocks. I found no campsites, tire tracks, or signs that anyone had been there. About 200 yards from the cabin, I came to a shallow cove. Dead reeds stood in the water, and driftwood had collected against a small gravel bar. The mud beside the cove contained a line of prints. They looked like shoe prints, not boots. The soles were narrow and smooth with small square heels. They came out of the water, crossed the gravel bar, and stopped near a cottonwood tree. There were no return tracks. The prints were deep and full of clear water, even though the mud around them was cloudy from the rain. I crouched beside one and touched the water. It felt warm. I stood up and looked around. The cove was empty. A low hum started beneath my feet. It was weaker than the sound at the cabin, but seemed to come through the ground. Small rings formed on the water near the reeds. I took 2 steps toward the lake. The humming stopped. The rings continued spreading for a few seconds, then disappeared. I went back to the cabin. That afternoon, I drove to Glenn and Marcy's place. Glenn was working on the motor of his fishing boat under a metal shelter. I asked whether he had heard machinery running after dark. He wiped his hands and looked toward the west shore. "What kind of machinery?" I described the humming. He did not answer right away. Marcy came outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She said they had heard it on Sunday night before I first noticed it. Their bedroom window faced west. Around 7:30, the glass had started vibrating. Glenn went outside, but the sound stopped before he reached the shore. He heard it again Monday. Marcy said she had seen lights moving low above the water. 3 of them, white and evenly spaced. She thought they belonged to a fishing boat. but the lights moved toward land and disappeared behind the trees. Glenn told her it was probably a vehicle on a distant road. There was no road on that side of the cove. I mentioned the shoe prints. Glenn became quiet. He asked if they led out of the water. I said yes. Marcy asked whether I had seen anyone near the cabins. I had not. She said a dark car had passed their place twice on Tuesday. It drove to the end of the access road, waited a few minutes, then returned. The road ended at my cabin. I had not heard or seen a car. That evening, I stayed at Glenn and Marcy's for dinner. At 7:35, all three of us heard the humming. It was louder there than at my cabin. The metal roof over the boat began to vibrate. A wrench rolled across Glenn's workbench and fell onto the ground. We walked toward the lake together. The sound stopped when we reached the edge. Marcy pointed west. A white light hovered above the cove. Two more appeared beside it. The three lights formed a straight line about 20 feet long. They moved slowly upward, then stopped. The middle light